The Trelka 9 border cutter wasn't built for excitement. It was built for tedium. Long loops along the Cardassian Federation demilitarized zone, cataloging debris fields, chasing the occasional smuggler dumb enough to think Cardassian patrols had gone soft since the war started, eating the Union's better ships whole. Dara Rethet had flown this same patrol lane for 6 years. She could recite its boredom the way other people recited prayers, which was why the return blip made her sit up so fast she cracked her elbow on the console. "Report," she snapped, already knowing Tovin's answer would be useless. Tovin was young. Tovin panicked at asteroid clusters. "I don't." He stared at his display like it had insulted his mother. "There's no warp signature, no subspace wake, no thruster trail. It's just there, Glyn. 1 second empty space. Next second a contact. Debris doesn't appear from nothing. It's not debris." Tovin's voice cracked. "It's reading as a solid biological mass. Humanoid. 1.8 meters. It's drifting, ma'am. No life support pod. No suit." Dara was already moving before he finished the sentence, boots hard against the deck plating, as she crossed to the tactical station and pulled the sensor feed up herself. The image resolved, slow, grainy. The kind of red you got when your sensors genuinely didn't know what category to file something under. A boy. Straw hat, red vest, tumbling gently in the vacuum of space, like he'd simply stepped off a curb and forgotten gravity existed. Completely unprotected, completely unbothered. And breathing. "That's not possible," Dara said, and meant it with her whole chest. 6 hours earlier, in a universe that didn't know the Alpha Quadrant existed, Monkey D. Luffy had been laughing. He didn't remember, later, exactly what he'd been laughing at. Something about Usopp's face when a cannonball nearly took his hat off. Probably. Or Zoro getting lost below decks on a boat with exactly 4 rooms. It didn't matter. What mattered was the storm. It hadn't looked like a storm. That was the thing everyone on the crew agreed on afterward, in the version of events that never actually got to happen, because there was no afterward for them to compare notes in. 1 second the sky over the Sunny was doing its normal business of being blue and enormous, and full of possibility. The next, a seam opened in it. Not a cloud, not a waterspout. Something with edges, something wrong in a way that made even Zoro's hand drift to his swords without him consciously deciding to move it. Luffy, being Luffy, had leaned toward it instead of away. "Oi, that's weird," he'd said, hanging off the front of the ship by one stretched arm, peering into a tear in the world like it was a particularly interesting tide pool. "Nami, what's that?" Nami had screamed something about getting away from it that Luffy, characteristically, filed under things to think about later. The rift didn't pull the ship. It didn't pull Usopp or Chopper or Sanji or anyone standing within 10 feet of the rubber captain currently draped across the bowsprit like a curious cat. It pulled him. Just him. A single thread yanked out of a tapestry. There'd been no pain. That was the strangest part. In the half-second he had to process it. No sense of falling, no crushing, none of the things his body's decades of adventuring had trained him to brace for. Just the Sunny disappearing behind him like someone had snuffed a candle, and then nothing. No ship, no sea, no sky he recognized. Just cold, and dark, and more stars than he had names for. Luffy blinked, looked around. Noted. With the particular calm of a man who had once fought a Yonko while missing an arm and considered it Tuesday, that he appeared to be in space. Actual space. The kind Frankie sometimes rambled about. The kind with no air and no water and, he checked, no obvious way to swim. "Huh," he said, to no one. He did not panic. This was, in retrospect, either the most reasonable or the single most insane response available to him, and it was entirely on brand that he defaulted immediately to the second option. He grinned, stretched both arms out as far as they'd go into the void, just to see what would happen, and laughed at the sheer size of everything around him. Vacuum, it turned out, didn't care how strong his haki was. He should have already been unconscious. He should, by any reasonable law of biology, have been dying. But Luffy's body had never particularly respected reasonable laws of anything, and the same rubber constitution that let him shrug off cannon fire and Kaido's club apparently found no oxygen to be an inconvenience rather than an emergency. His haki, observation humming faintly at the edges of his awareness even here, picking up nothing, an emptiness so total it was almost its own kind of information, kept his body's danger sense wired tight, even as his lungs began, slowly, to ache. He had maybe 10 minutes before that ache became a real problem. It was around minute 4 that the Trelka 9 found him. Dara Rethet had run tractor beam recovery drills 100 times. She'd never run one on a target that, the second it entered the cutter's hangar bay and the emergency atmosphere kicked back in, sat bolt upright, gasped in a lungful of recycled Cardassian air like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted, and then looked directly at the 3 armed guards surrounding him and said, in a language the universal translator took a full 2 seconds to process, because it had never encountered anything quite like it before. The guards did not lower their disruptors. Dara, watching from the observation deck above the hangar, felt something cold settle behind her sternum, the specific, professional dread of a soldier who has just watched every threat assessment protocol she knew fail to produce a category for what she was looking at. The boy, because up close, on the internal feed, that's clearly what he was. Some scrawny kid barely out of his teens if the biosigns were to be believed. Didn't look dangerous. That was almost worse. He looked delighted. He was patting himself down, checking his straw hat was still on his head, with the particular tenderness of someone checking on a sleeping pet, entirely unbothered by 3 weapons trained on his chest. "Identify yourself," barked the lead guard, Glyn Prethok, in Cardassian first, then, at the translator's prompting, again in standard. "I'm Luffy." The boy beamed like this was the best question anyone had asked him all week. "Monkey D. Luffy. Where's this? This your ship? Cool ship. Smells like metal. You will state your point of origin and your business in Cardassian space." Luffy tilted his head, genuinely puzzled. "Cardassian space? Is that near the Grand Line?" Prethok's patience, already thin, snapped clean through. "Restrain him." What happened next took 11 seconds, and Dara would spend years afterward describing it to people who didn't believe her. Prethok lunged. It was a good lunge, trained, fast, the kind of strike that had put down Klingon boarding parties twice his size. His fist connected solidly with the side of Luffy's head, and bounced, not glanced off, not was blocked. Bounced, with an audible rubbery thwip, Prethok's whole arm recoiling back like he'd punched a loaded spring, the force of his own blow sending him staggering 3 full steps backward, while Luffy's head simply rolled with the impact and came back to center, entirely unfazed, hat still perfectly in place. "Ow, hey," Luffy said, more offended than hurt. "That's rude. I didn't even do anything yet." The second and third guards fired, disruptor bolts, real ones, not stun, because nobody in that hangar bay was thinking about mercy anymore, only about the sudden gaping hole where their understanding of physics used to be. Both bolts struck Luffy square in the chest. He staggered back half a step, more from the momentum than the damage, looked down at 2 smoking, faintly singed patches on his vest, and made a small, thoughtful noise, like a man checking a weather report and finding it slightly worse than expected. "That kinda tickled," he said. Dara, from the observation deck, had already hit the ship-wide alert. What none of the 3 guards knew, what none of anyone in the Alpha Quadrant yet knew, was that the boy currently absorbing point-blank disruptor fire without so much as a burn, hadn't so much as engaged a single layer of his real defenses. He hadn't armament hockeyed his skin. He hadn't needed to. Rubber didn't conduct energy the way flesh did, and a disruptor built to cut through organic tissue and shielded hulls had, against Luffy's body, simply found nothing solid to disrupt. He hadn't even decided yet whether these people were enemies. He was mostly just hungry, and a little annoyed about the punching. "Look," Luffy said, raising both hands. Not in surrender, just to make a point. The universal gesture of a man trying to de-escalate a conversation with idiots. "I'm not trying to start anything. I just want to know where I am, and if you guys have meat." "Do you have meat?" Prethok, cradling his throbbing hand, was in no mood for meat-based diplomacy. "Weapons free," he snarled into his comm badge. "All units, this bay is compromised. The bay doors sealed." Emergency force fields flickered up along the bulkheads. Standard Cardassian containment protocol for exactly this kind of unclassified threat scenario. The kind of fail-safe built into every military vessel for the day something genuinely unprecedented happened aboard. Red light washed the hangar. Somewhere above, klaxons began their slow, rising wail. Luffy looked around at the sudden lockdown with the mild curiosity of a man watching weather change. "Oh," he said, "is this a fight now?" Nobody answered him directly, which he took reasonably as a yes. Captain Elias Vaughn of the USS Bellerophon was 3 sectors away, running convoy escort along the DMZ with the tired, grinding vigilance of a man 11 months into a war he'd stopped believing would end cleanly, when the priority alert crossed his console. Cardassian vessel Trelka 9 declaring emergency. Unidentified biological contact. Hangar bay breach. Requesting immediate. The message cut off mid-sentence. Vaughn read it twice. Around him, the bridge had gone quiet in that particular way bridges did when everyone was pretending not to eavesdrop on the captain's console. "Lieutenant Osei," he said, "pull up everything we've got on the Trelka 9's last transmission. All of it. Raw feed if you have it." "Aye, sir." "Captain, this is strange. Their internal sensors are reading a single humanoid contact throwing off energy discharges, consistent with disruptor fire, but the biosens aren't matching the damage. It's like," Osei frowned at her own readout, "it's like the weapon fire isn't registering as having hit anything at all. Meaning either their sensors are malfunctioning, or something on that ship just tanked 3 point-blank disruptor hits and kept walking." Vaughn had commanded a starship for the better part of a decade. He'd faced the Dominion at Chintoka. He'd watched good officers die at the Second Battle of Deep Space Nine. He liked to believe very little could genuinely surprise him anymore. He felt the old, familiar cold drop in his stomach anyway. Helm, plot an intercept course. Best possible speed. He kept his voice level, the way he always did when his gut told him the day had just gotten considerably worse. "And get me Starfleet command. If the Cardassians have got something loose on one of their own ships that their weapons can't put down, I want to know about it before we're the next ones staring down the barrel of it." The Bellerophon came about, engines climbing to warp 8, cutting hard toward a border cutter that, 3 sectors away, had just discovered that all its training, all its protocols, and all its firepower amounted to exactly nothing against a boy who was currently, politely, asking his captors one more time whether they happened to have any meat. They did not. This, more than the punching, was the thing that finally made Luffy decide to stop being polite. He didn't attack first. That wasn't how he worked, not really, not even against people currently trying to kill him. Luffy's fights had a shape to them, an internal logic that had nothing to do with fairness, and everything to do with reading a room, reading a person, deciding in the half-second before violence became inevitable, whether these were people worth hurting, or just people who hadn't figured out yet that they'd already lost. Observation Haki told him things his eyes couldn't. It told him Prethok was scared under the anger, The particular fear of a man whose entire understanding of what a fight was had just been quietly demolished. It told him the two other guards were waiting for orders, not actually eager for this. It told him, distantly, at the edge of his range, filtered through walls and decks and a hull made of some metal he didn't recognize, that there were more of these people throughout the ship, dozens of them, and above and around all of it, a growing, tightening sense of a much bigger weapon spinning up somewhere he couldn't quite place yet. "All right," Luffy said, rolling his shoulders, the grin sliding into something sharper, something the Yonko of his own world would have recognized instantly and respected. "You're not gonna stop, huh?" Prethok raised his weapon a third time. "Surrender is your only." Luffy moved. He didn't use gear second. Didn't need to, not yet. Not against three men with hand weapons in a sealed room. His arm simply extended, faster than a disruptor bolt could track, faster than Cardassian reflexes, honed on decades of brutal occupation warfare, could process as a threat before it had already resolved. Armament Haki blackened his fist in a flicker, a texture like poured obsidian sliding over rubber knuckles, and the punch that followed didn't bounce off anyone this time. It went through the deck plating behind Prethok's head after clipping his shoulder and sending him into the far bulkhead hard enough to crack the polymer coating. The other two guards fired in unison. Luffy twisted, not fast in the showy cinematic way, but with the eerie, total efficiency of a body that had spent 2 years training under a man who threw thunderclouds for a hobby, and let both bolts sail past him through empty space where he simply, calmly, was not anymore. Gomu Gomu no. He planted one foot, torqued his whole body like a slingshot drawn to its limit, both fists cocking back simultaneously. Gatling. The strikes that followed weren't fast so much as they were continuous. A blur of black-veined rubber arms hammering both remaining guards into unconsciousness in under 2 seconds, each blow calibrated, because even mid-fight, some instinct in Luffy still cared about this, still drew a line he rarely crossed against people who weren't truly trying to end him, to bruise, to break bones if it came to that, but not to kill. Silence settled over the hangar bay, broken only by the tired hum of overhead lighting and 3 groaning, thoroughly beaten Cardassian soldiers scattered across the deck. Luffy straightened his hat, exhaled, and looked up toward the observation window where he could feel Observation Haki painting a shape he couldn't quite see but could absolutely sense. Someone watching him. "Hey," he called up, cheerful again now that the fighting part was done, like a switch had flipped back to its default setting. "Seriously though, you got any meat on this ship?" Above him, Glyn Dara Rethet stood frozen at the observation deck console, one hand hovering over the emergency channel that would, in about 90 seconds, connect her directly to Central Command and begin a chain of escalating alerts that would reach across 3 governments before the day was out. She keyed it open. "This is the Trelka 9, she said, and her voice, to her professional embarrassment, shook only slightly. I don't know how to classify what we need. Send everything. Send everyone. We have made contact with something we do not understand, and it just put down 3 armed guards without appearing to try. Somewhere 3 sectors away, the Bellerophon was already burning hard toward them at Warp 8. Somewhere much further out, in a listening post buried deep in territory the Federation didn't officially know existed yet, a Vorta liaison named Wayun 7 received a flash priority intelligence summary, read it twice with his characteristic small, pleasant smile, and immediately requested an audience with the nearest founder. The quadrant, for the first time since the war began, had a genuinely new variable. It did not yet know what to do with him. The Bellerophon dropped out of warp 11 minutes after Dara Rethet's flash priority call reached Starfleet Command, close enough to the Trelka 9 that Vaughn could see the Cardassian cutter through the forward viewport, running lights steady, no visible hull damage, Nothing that screamed catastrophe. Just a small, tense, blinking ship sitting dead in space, like it was waiting to see what happened next. "Hail them," Vaughn said. It took 3 tries before the Cardassians answered. And when they did, the face on the view screen belonged to a woman who looked like she hadn't slept and didn't expect to for a while. Glyn Rethet. Vaughn had pulled her service record on the way over. Solid officer, unremarkable postings, the kind of career soldier who wasn't supposed to end up at the center of anything historic. "Captain," Rethet said, with the clipped formality of someone holding herself together through sheer discipline, "I appreciate the response, but I should tell you Central Command has already dispatched a warship. You may be here on a courtesy basis only." "Noted. What's your situation?" Rethet's jaw tightened. "Contained. For now. The subject is currently in our secondary cargo hold, under guard, and has not attempted to leave." "Has not attempted," Vaughn repeated. "That's an odd way to describe custody." "It's an accurate way, Captain." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not quite fear. Something closer to professional humiliation. 3 of my crew engaged him with standard-issue weapons at point-blank range. He is, as far as I can tell, entirely uninjured. He is currently in the hold, not because we are holding him, but because he appears to be waiting for something. Possibly food. He has asked 4 times. Vaughn glanced sideways at his first officer, Commander Tepreth, whose single raised eyebrow communicated exactly the amount of Vulcan skepticism the situation warranted. "I'd like permission to send a small team aboard," Vaughn said. "Observers only. I think it's in everyone's interest that this doesn't become a purely Cardassian problem, given what you're describing." A long pause, then quietly, "Central Command will not thank me for this. But yes, come aboard, Captain. I would very much like a second opinion on what we're looking at." Luffy, for his part, had made himself comfortable. He sat cross-legged in the middle of the cargo hold, straw hat tipped back, humming something tuneless and cheerful, while 4 Cardassian guards stood around the room's perimeter with weapons that, after the hangar bay, none of them particularly trusted anymore. Nobody had cuffed him. Nobody had tried. The one attempt at restraints, a set of Cardassian binding cuffs, magnetically sealed, rated to hold a Klingon, had simply slid off his wrists when he flexed, with an expression of mild interest rather than defiance, like he was testing a toy. "These are neat," he'd said, examining the cuffs afterward. "Can I keep them?" Nobody had answered. Nobody had known how. When the doors opened and Vaughn stepped through with Tepreth and 2 security officers, Luffy's head came up immediately, Observation Haki registering the new arrivals before his eyes even confirmed it. Different uniform, different bearing, less afraid than the others. He grinned. "Oh hey, more people. You got food?" "Captain Elias Vaughn, Federation Starship Bellerophon." Vaughn kept his hands visible, his posture deliberately unthreatening, the same body language he'd have used approaching a wounded Klingon or a spooked civilian. Command training that assumed, correctly, that whatever this was, force had already failed once. "I understand you've had a difficult day." "Not really." Luffy tilted his head. "It's been kinda boring, actually. Except the punching part. You got a name?" "Federation. Is that like a country?" "It's an alliance of worlds. May I sit?" "Sure." Luffy patted the deck beside him with the easy hospitality of a man welcoming someone onto his own ship, rather than sitting in another government's cargo hold under guard. "You're a lot calmer than the other guys." They kept yelling. Vaughn sat, close enough to gauge the boys' reactions, far enough to respect what remained of his security detail's nerves. Up close, there was nothing about Luffy that read as dangerous in any conventional sense. Scrawny build, scarred but young face, an open, guileless expression that Vaughn's decades of reading hostile diplomats and desperate refugees both told him was almost certainly genuine. That was, if anything, more unsettling than a snarl would have been. Threat assessment protocols weren't built for genuinely friendly, and also apparently indestructible. "Where are you from?" Vaughn asked. "East Blue originally, but I've been all over. Alabasta, Water 7, Dressrosa, Wano." Luffy ticked the names off on his fingers, then stopped, frowning slightly, the first real crack of uncertainty Vaughn had seen in him. "None of that means anything to you, huh?" "No, it doesn't." "Yeah." Luffy scratched the back of his head. "Figured. When the sky did the weird tearing thing, and I ended up here. This another sea? Grand Line's got weird islands, but I never heard of one that just dumps you in the middle of nowhere, with stars everywhere and no water." "You're not on an island, or a sea. You're in space, between star systems. We're in what's called the Alpha Quadrant." Luffy absorbed this the way he absorbed most information, quickly, without visible distress, filing it under things to figure out later, rather than things to panic about. "Huh, is my crew here too?" And there it was, the question underneath the question, the thing Vaughn's observation Haki-blind human senses still picked up anyway, in the small hitch of Luffy's voice on the word crew. Whatever else this boy was, whatever he could apparently shrug off physically, that question mattered to him more than the disruptor fire had. "I don't know," Vaughn said honestly. "We detected only you. If others came through with you, we haven't found them." Something moved behind Luffy's eyes. Not panic, Vaughn noted, filing it away, but a fast, cold flicker of resolve, gone almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by the same easy grin. Whatever grief or worry lived under that expression, this was clearly a young man extremely practiced at not letting it show. "Okay," Luffy said. "Then I gotta find a way back to them. That's the plan. You know how to do that?" "I don't," Vaughn admitted. "I'm not sure anyone in this quadrant does. What happened to you, the way you arrived, isn't something our science has a category for yet." "Great." Luffy flopped backward onto the deck, staring up at the ceiling with the particular theatrical despair of someone who found the universe personally annoying rather than genuinely threatening. "So I'm stuck, for the moment. I'd like to help you figure out how not to be, if you're willing to let us." Luffy sat back up, studying Vaughn with an intensity that didn't match the rest of his easygoing demeanor. Observation Haki doing something Vaughn couldn't see but could, on some animal level, feel being done to him, like being weighed on a scale that measured something other than mass. "You're not lying," Luffy said finally, more to himself than to Vaughn. "Okay, I believe you." Then, brightening instantly, "But seriously, do you have meat? I haven't eaten since. Actually, I don't know how long it's been. Is time even the same here?" Vaughn found himself, against every instinct honed by 11 months of grinding war, almost smiling. "I can arrange food. You're all right," Luffy said, with the air of a verdict rendered and finalized. "Better than the punchy guys." It was in the corridor outside the cargo hold, out of Luffy's earshot but well within range of things Vaughn didn't yet know to worry about, that Glyn Rethet caught up to him, flanked now by a Cardassian officer Vaughn hadn't met. Older, sharper-eyed, the kind of bearing that meant Central Command authority rather than Field Command. "Captain Vaughn." The newcomer inclined her head with exactly the correct amount of diplomatic frost. "Gul Tarnik Zera. I'll be assuming command of this situation on behalf of the Union." "Gul Zera." Vaughn kept his tone level. "I take it Central Command has decided this isn't a courtesy matter after all." "Central Command has decided," Zera said, "that an asset capable of tanking point-blank disruptor fire and disabling 3 trained soldiers without apparent injury is not something we intend to hand back to the Federation, with a polite note of thanks." Her eyes were flat, assessing, doing the same threat calculus Vaughn had watched her subordinates fail to complete an hour earlier. We are, however, at war, Captain, and an asset like this is worth considerably more as a weapon than as a prisoner. He's not a weapon, Vaughn said. He's a person, a frightened one. Whatever he's showing you on the surface, he's separated from everyone he knows, in a part of the galaxy he's never heard of, and so far the only welcome he's received has been gunfire. Sentiment, Zahra said, is a luxury the Union stopped affording itself some time ago. I intend to have him assessed, and if the assessment confirms what my people witnessed, I intend to see what the Union can offer him in exchange for his cooperation. Freely, if he's amenable. Otherwise, she let the sentence hang, cold and deliberate. Otherwise what? Vaughn asked, though he already suspected the answer. Zahra's expression didn't change. Otherwise, we discover exactly how contained an uncontained variable can be made, Captain. This is a war for the survival of my people. I will not apologize for treating a gift like one. Behind her, Rethet's face was carefully neutral in the way of a soldier who'd learned not to let her opinions show in front of superiors, but Vaughn caught the smallest tightening around her eyes. Whatever Rethet had witnessed in that cargo hold, whatever calculus she'd run in the hours since, some part of her clearly didn't share her goal's confidence in how contained Luffy actually was, gift or not. Vaughn chose his next words with the care of a man who'd spent a war learning exactly how thin the ice under interstellar diplomacy could run. I'd remind the Gull that this individual arrived inside Federation-adjacent space, was recovered by a Cardassian vessel operating along a jointly patrolled demilitarized zone, and has, as of this conversation, harmed no one who didn't shoot at him first. I don't believe either of our governments has clean legal ground to claim sole custody. I'd suggest a joint approach before someone tries to solve this with force and discovers exactly how well that worked the first time. For a moment, Zahra said nothing, weighing something behind flat gray-green eyes. You have 12 hours, Captain, she said finally. Bring this to your command. Bring it to mine. If our governments cannot produce an arrangement in that window, the Union will act unilaterally, and I do not think your Federation wants to discover what unilateral looks like when Central Command believes it has found the edge of a war-ending advantage. She turned and left without waiting for a response, Rethet trailing a half-step behind, throwing one last unreadable glance back toward the cargo hold doors before they both disappeared around the corridor bend. Vaughn exhaled slowly, rubbing at the bridge of his nose, and opened a channel to his own ship. To Preth, get Starfleet Command on a secure line. Tell them we have 12 hours to decide how the Federation feels about a walking weapon of unknown origin sitting in Cardassian custody. And tell them if we don't move fast, the Cardassians are going to make that decision for everyone. 2 systems away, in a listening post the Federation's intelligence services had never quite managed to locate, Wayon 7 stood before a shifting pool of golden mist that pretended, for the sake of conversation, to hold a vaguely humanoid shape. You have the full report, Wayon said, hands folded, smile fixed in its perpetual, faintly apologetic register. I confess I find it fascinating. A being that survives vacuum unaided, that shrugs off directed energy weapons without apparent shielding technology, that single-handedly incapacitated an armed Cardassian security detail using what our analysts can only describe as. He consulted the pad in his hand, his arm becoming extremely long. The Founder's not-quite face didn't shift, but something in the quality of the silence conveyed displeasure at being amused against her will. You find this a joke, Wayon. I find it an opportunity, Founder. The Cardassians are already maneuvering to claim him as an asset. The Federation, if their pattern of behavior holds, will attempt something naive and principled instead. An alliance, an offer of asylum, some appeal to his better nature. Wayon's smile widened by a fraction, the closest thing to genuine relish the Vorta genome allowed him. Either approach leaves an opening, If this being is even a fraction as capable as the reports suggest, the Dominion cannot afford to let solids reach him first and keep him. And if he cannot be reached or reasoned with, or contained, then, Weyoun said, with the calm of a man discussing weather rather than war, we ensure he becomes a problem for the Federation and the Cardassians to share, rather than a solution either of them gets to keep. Founder, I would recommend we send the Jem'Hadar to observe, not engage. Not yet. First Ninek's unit is nearby, and disciplined enough not to do anything regrettable without orders. The golden mist coiled thoughtfully. See that they don't, the founder said. I want to know what this creature is, Weyoun, before anyone decides what he's worth. Of course, founder. Weyoun bowed, already composing, behind that ever-present smile, 3 separate contingencies for what happened if First Ninek's restraint proved less reliable than promised. Somewhere between a Federation starship, a Cardassian cutter, and a founder's quiet, patient calculation, the quadrant's newest variable was, at that exact moment, cheerfully devouring his first plate of replicated meat in this universe, and pronouncing it, with the easy, oblivious confidence of a boy who had no idea 3 governments were already drawing lines around him. Pretty good, but kinda weird tasting. The clock Zahra had set was already running. Starfleet Command received Vaughn's report at 0347 hours station time, and by 0412 the situation had already climbed 3 levels past anything a starship captain was authorized to resolve on his own. Admiral Yuki Tanaka read the initial sensor logs twice before she called for a secure channel to the Bellerophon, and a third time while she waited for the connection to establish, because some part of her kept expecting the numbers to resolve into something more ordinary on a second look. They didn't. A single humanoid organism, no discernible technology, no warp signature, no life support requirement demonstrated during exposure to vacuum, capable of withstanding sustained directed energy fire without measurable tissue damage. Captain Vaughn, she said, when his face resolved on her screen, tired and drawn in the low light of the Bellerophon's ready room. Walk me through what you're not putting in the written report. Vaughn allowed himself a small, humorless smile. He's polite, Admiral. Genuinely, unnervingly polite. Once you get past the fact that he casually deflected disruptor fire an hour before I met him. He's not hiding anything as far as I can tell. He's confused. He's separated from people he clearly cares about. And near as I can piece together, in his own frame of reference, none of what he did back there registers to him as remarkable. It's just Tuesday. And the Cardassians? Gul Zahra's given us 12 hours to produce a joint arrangement before the Union moves unilaterally. I believe her. Central Command's been bleeding ships for the better part of a year, Admiral. An asset like this, even the rumor of one, is worth more to them right now than diplomatic niceties. Tanaka was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant she was doing the math several senior officers had already started doing independently, across 2 governments. What does he want, Captain? Not what does he need. What does he actually want? To go home, Vaughn said. Failing that, to find whoever else might have come through with him. Failing that, he considered his next words carefully. I think he wants to know who to trust. He hasn't decided that yet. And Admiral, I'd urge whatever we propose to keep that fact front and center. This isn't a resource to be allocated. He's already turned down one attempt at coercion by walking away from it mostly bored. I don't think force is going to work on him, and I don't think it's going to work on the Cardassians' patience either, if we let this drag. Understood. I'm convening an emergency session with the Diplomatic Corps and Starfleet Intelligence. I want you to keep him comfortable, keep him talking, and above all, keep this from becoming a shooting incident before we've had a chance to think. Tanaka's eyes flicked to something off-screen. Another report, arriving even as they spoke. Captain, one more thing. Long-range sensor platforms along the DMZ picked up unusual Dominion communications traffic in the last hour. Encrypted, High priority, routed through channels we don't normally see, used for routine matters. Vaughn's jaw tightened. They know something, Tanaka corrected, which means the 12 hours the Cardassians gave you may be more of a courtesy than anyone realizes. Move fast, Captain. I don't like how many interested parties are suddenly circling one confused young man. Luffy, unaware that he'd become the subject of emergency sessions on two sides of a shooting war and quiet reconnaissance on a third, had moved on from his meal to a considerably more pressing concern. He was bored, and boredom, in his experience, was usually solved by finding someone interesting to talk to or something interesting to hit. "Hey," he said, to the young security ensign who'd drawn the short straw of standing guard in the cargo hold doorway, while Vaughn conferred elsewhere. "What's your name?" The ensign, a nervous, freckled human named Corrigan, who'd been in Starfleet for exactly 14 months and had definitely not trained for this, hesitated. "Ensign Corrigan, sir." "You don't gotta call me sir. I'm not like in charge of anything." Luffy grinned. "You ever fight anybody? You look kinda jumpy." We don't typically discuss operational history with prisoners?" Luffy asked, without rancor, more curious than offended. "Am I a prisoner?" Corrigan opened his mouth, closed it, clearly unequipped by any academy course to answer that question honestly. Luffy laughed, an easy, genuine sound that seemed to catch the young ensign off guard more than any of the day's violence had. "It's fine," Luffy said. "I get it. Everybody's confused. I'm confused too. Wanna know a secret?" He leaned forward conspiratorially, and Corrigan, despite every regulation telling him not to engage, found himself leaning in slightly too. "I don't actually know where I am, what a federation is, or how to get home. I'm just kinda going with it until something makes sense." "That doesn't sound like a great strategy," Corrigan admitted. "It's the only one I've got." Luffy shrugged, settling back. "Worked out okay so far, mostly." It was in this moment, Luffy mid-laugh, Corrigan halfway to actually relaxing, that observation Haki did what it always did. It noticed something before conscious thought caught up. A flicker, distant, a presence moving through the ship's corridors with a quality Luffy recognized instantly from 1,000 fights across 2 seas. Not fear, not caution, hunger, the specific, focused intent of something looking for a fight and expecting to find one. Luffy's grin didn't fade, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Hey," he said, casual. "You got anybody weird on board? Like, not weird. I mean weird like trouble weird." Corrigan blinked. "No, why?" The ship's intercom cut him off. Vaughn's voice suddenly urgent over the comm. "Security to Cargo Bay 2. All hands, red alert. We have an unidentified transporter signature." The air in the far corner of the hold shimmered, not the smooth, familiar cascade of a Starfleet transporter beam, but something rougher, colder, edged with a faint green tint that made Corrigan's hand fly instinctively to his phaser. Luffy was already on his feet. The shimmer resolved into a squad of Jem'Hadar, 4 of them, gray-skinned and armored, disruptor rifles already raised, moving with the disciplined, economical precision of soldiers who did not waste motion. At their head stood a broader figure whose bearing marked him instantly as command. First Ninek, Ketracell tube pulsing faintly at his throat, eyes fixed immediately and without hesitation on Luffy. "You are the anomaly," Ninek said. It wasn't a question. "Depends what you mean by anomaly," Luffy said, rolling his shoulders. All traces of the easy conversation with Corrigan gone, replaced by something colder, and far older than his apparent age. "You gonna tell me who you are? Or we skipping straight to the part where you point guns at me?" "Jem'Hadar do not require introductions before combat." Ninek's mouth curled, not quite a smile. Jem'Hadar didn't really smile, not the way humans did. but there was something in the set of his jaw that read as anticipation. The Founders wish to assess your capability. I have been instructed to determine it directly. Founders, Luffy repeated, testing the word. That your bosses? They are the Dominion. Ninnik raised a hand, and his 3 subordinates fanned out with mechanical precision. Disruptor rifles tracking. Obedience is not a request. Solid. It is the entire shape of our existence. Yours is about to become considerably more limited. Corrigan had his phaser up, hands shaking slightly, voice cracking as he shouted for backup he knew wouldn't arrive in time. Luffy, without looking at him, put a hand out, not touching him, just a gesture. Stay back. Delivered with an authority that made the young ensign obey despite every training instinct screaming at him to act. This is between me and them, Luffy said quietly. Then, louder, to Ninnik. You're not the first guys to point guns at me today. Didn't go great for the last group. The Cardassians are soft, Ninnik said. We are not. We'll see. Ninnik's hand dropped. The Jem'Hadar fired as one. Luffy didn't dodge this time. He'd read enough in the half-second of Ninnik's stance, the discipline in his squad's formation, the particular quality of controlled violence radiating off all 4 of them, to know these weren't soldiers who'd be rattled by a missed shot or overconfident enough to leave an opening on their own. This was a different caliber of fight than 3 startled Cardassian guards. So instead of dodging, he let Armament Haki flood outward, that black, glassy sheen sliding across his skin in an instant, hardening rubber into something that could stop a blade, and simply stood there as 4 disruptor bolts converged on his chest. The impact staggered him, genuinely this time, driving him back a full step, smoke curling faintly off blackened Haki, where the energy dissipated rather than penetrated. Not nothing this time, not a tickle. His arm ached where one bolt had clipped it at an angle Haki hadn't fully covered. Ninnek's eyes narrowed, the first flicker of something other than contempt. You endured that. Yeah. Luffy rolled the ache out of his shoulder, grin returning, sharper now, hungrier. You're better than the last guys. Good. That's more fun. He didn't bother announcing the next move. Gear Second kicked in with a soft hiss of blood pumping harder through rubber veins, steam curling faintly off his skin as his metabolism redlined into overdrive, and he closed the 15 meters between himself and the nearest Jem'Hadar soldier, in a blur too fast for Corrigan's eyes to properly track, let alone the soldier's reflexes. Gomu Gomu no jet pistol. The strike caught the Jem'Hadar mid-reload, sent him crashing back through a stack of cargo containers hard enough to crumple Cardassian-grade Durasteel. The second and third soldiers pivoted to compensate, disciplined even in shock, adjusting fire patterns with the kind of tactical fluidity Luffy recognized and, despite himself, respected. These weren't panicking. They were adapting, mid-fight, the way real veterans did. He respected it enough to stop holding back on speed. What followed was less a battle than a demonstration. 6 seconds of Gear Second Luffy moving through the remaining Jem'Hadar, with the brutal, controlled efficiency of 2 years' training, under a warlord who'd once made him spar against literal lightning. Bones broke, armor cracked, none of them died. Luffy's restraint held even at full speed, some deep-seated code even Gear Second couldn't override. But by the time the smoke cleared, 3 Jem'Hadar lay unconscious or immobilized across the ruined cargo bay, and only First Ninnik remained standing. Ninnik looked, for the first time since materializing, genuinely uncertain. You are not simply strong, he said slowly, disruptor rifle lowering a fraction, some deeper Jem'Hadar instinct recalculating an equation that had clearly never come out this way before. You are learning as you fight. Everybody does that, Luffy said, breathing hard now, steam still curling off his skin, Gear Second's toll starting to show in the slight burn of overworked muscle. You're just not used to fighting people who do it faster than you can react to. Ninek raised his rifle one final time, not out of hope for victory, Luffy realized with a flicker of observation-sharpened understanding, but out of something closer to duty. Jem'Hadar didn't retreat. Jem'Hadar didn't surrender. Whatever came next, Ninek intended to see it through to whatever end awaited him, because that was the entire shape of what he'd been engineered to be. Luffy found, unexpectedly, that he didn't want to be the one to give him that ending. "Hey," he said, before Ninek could fire. "You don't gotta die for this. Whoever your bosses are, the founders, they sent you to test me, right? Not to actually win?" Ninek said nothing, which Luffy took, correctly, as confirmation. "Then you got your answer. Go tell him." Luffy straightened, some of the tension bleeding out of his shoulders, Gear Second's steam beginning to fade, as he consciously stood down. "I'm not looking for a war with people I don't even know yet. But if you send more guys after me thinking I'll go easier next time, you're gonna be wrong." For a long moment, First Ninek stood motionless amid the wreckage of his squad, disruptor rifle trembling faintly at the edge of a decision that ran counter to everything the White had ever demanded of him. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon. "The founders will hear of this," he said, voice rough. "All of it." He tapped a device at his wrist, and the same rough, green-tinted shimmer that had brought them began gathering around his fallen soldiers. "This is not mercy, Solid. Do not mistake it for gratitude. Wouldn't dream of it," Luffy said. The Jem'Hadar vanished in a wash of unstable transporter light, leaving behind scorched deck plating, a stunned Ensign Corrigan still frozen at the doorway, and a cargo bay that would need considerable repair. Luffy exhaled, sat back down cross-legged in the wreckage, and looked up at Corrigan with his usual easy grin, as if the last 90 seconds had been nothing more than an unusually athletic stretch. "So," he said, "about that food. You think they got dessert on this ship too?" Corrigan, phaser still trembling slightly in his hand, could only stare. 3 sectors away, Wayun 7 received First Ninek's report with the small, delighted smile of a man whose worst fears and best hopes had just been confirmed simultaneously, and immediately requested a second audience with the founder. Because whatever this boy in the straw hat turned out to be, it was already very clear the Dominion could not simply test him and walk away unchanged. The wreckage of Cargo Bay 2 told a story Gul Zera didn't like reading twice. She stood in the scorched center of it 3 hours later, boots crunching over shattered durasteel that had, until recently, been structural cargo containers rated to withstand a photon torpedo's proximity blast. Revit stood a pace behind her, arms folded, saying nothing, because there was nothing useful to say that wouldn't sound like an accusation against a ghoul who'd spent the last 3 hours being very publicly wrong about how contained this situation actually was. "Jem'Hadar," Zera said quietly. "On a Cardassian vessel, without so much as a courtesy notification to Central Command. 4 of them, ma'am. All extracted alive according to the transporter residue analysis." Rethet's voice was carefully flat. "The boy could have killed them. He didn't. I'm aware." Zera crouched, running a gloved hand along a scorch mark in the deck plating, the char pattern consistent with sustained disruptor fire absorbed and dissipated rather than deflected, which tells me something considerably more concerning than if he had. "Ma'am? It tells me he's choosing restraint, Glynn. That's not the behavior of an animal, or a weapon, or even most soldiers I've served with." Zera straightened, expression unreadable. "It's the behavior of someone with enough power that mercy costs him nothing, and enough judgment to know exactly how far he can let a fight go before it stops being a lesson and starts being a massacre. That is, without exception, the most dangerous kind of person I have ever encountered." Behind them, the cargo bay doors hissed open, and Vaughn strode through with 2 Starfleet security officers in tow, his expression grim, in a way Zara recognized instantly. The look of a man who'd just gotten off a call with people considerably more senior than either of them. Gul Zara. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The Dominion just breached your ship and engaged an unarmed foreign national with lethal force. And I'd wager my career that Starfleet intelligence's read on that founder-ordered probe is going to look a great deal like an opening move, rather than an isolated incident. Your wager would be sound, Captain. Zara's jaw tightened, which changes my calculus rather significantly. I came here prepared to negotiate custody with the Federation. I did not come prepared to discover the Dominion considers him worth the same risk we do, or that they're willing to move on him this fast. Then maybe, Vaughn said, it's time we stopped treating this as a custody question and started treating it as a security one. Neither of us can protect him alone. If the Dominion tries again, and they will, a fractured response gets someone killed, possibly several someones, possibly not him. Zara studied him for a long moment, weighing, Vaughn suspected, not just the tactical logic, but the political cost of what he was about to propose. Cardassian pride ran deep, deeper than most Federation officers ever fully appreciated, and asking a ghoul to share an asset her own government had all but claimed by right of recovery was not a small thing. Central Command will resist a joint arrangement, she said finally. They will see it as the Federation exploiting Cardassian vulnerability during wartime. Then let's give them a reason not to resist it, Vaughn said. Let the boy decide. Not us, not Central Command, not Starfleet Command. Him. If he chooses to stay under Cardassian protection, the Federation stands down. If he chooses otherwise, I'd ask the Union to respect that choice, rather than force the issue. Because Gul, I don't think forcing anything with him ends well for whoever tries it. Something in Zara's expression shifted. Not agreement exactly, but a recalculation. The specific look of a career soldier weighing pride against survival, and finding pride, for once, wanting. You believe he'll choose the Federation, she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. I believe, Vaughn said carefully, that he'll choose whoever treats him like a person instead of an asset. I'd like that to be both of us, honestly. I don't think this needs to be a competition. Zara almost smiled, a thin, humorless expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Everything is a competition, Captain. That is simply the nature of the quadrant we live in. But I'll grant you this much. I would rather share him with the Federation than lose him to the Dominion out of stubbornness. Bring him to a table. Let him hear both offers. We'll let the boy make his own war calculus, since apparently everyone else in this sector has stopped trusting their own. They found Luffy exactly where they'd left him, cross-legged in the ruined cargo bay, working his way through what appeared to be his third plate of replicated food, chatting amiably with a still-shaken but gradually recovering Ensign Corrigan about, of all things, swimming. So that's the thing, Luffy was saying, gesturing with a fork. I can't swim at all, not even a little. Devil fruit users just sink like rocks. Kinda funny when you think about it, considering I'm captain of a pirate crew. That seems like a significant operational vulnerability, Corrigan said, some of his professional composure returning now that the immediate crisis had passed. Yeah, my crew reminds me constantly. Luffy grinned, then looked up as Vaughn and Zara approached, Rethet trailing behind. Oh, hey, you guys look serious. Something happen? We'd like to talk to you, Vaughn said, about what comes next. Luffy set his plate aside, some of the easy humor fading into the sharper, more attentive version of himself that Vaughn was beginning to recognize as the boy's actual baseline. The goofiness wasn't a mask exactly, but it clearly wasn't the whole picture either. Okay, he said. Talk. Zara took the lead, her tone shifting into something Vaughn recognized as her diplomatic register. Still cold, still precise, but stripped of the earlier threat. You are, at present, the subject of considerable interest from multiple governments in this region of space. The Cardassian Union, the Federation, and, as you've now personally experienced, the Dominion, all have reasons to want you under their influence, whether as an ally, an asset, or a weapon. Yeah, I picked up on that, Luffy said dryly. The gun stuff was a hint. The Union is prepared to offer you protection, resources, and a place within our territory, in exchange for your assistance against a mutual threat we are currently losing a war to. Zera's eyes didn't waver. I will not insult you by pretending that offer is without self-interest. It isn't, but it is honest, and it is better than what the Dominion intends for you, which is considerably less generous. And the Federation. Luffy looked to Vaughn. Vaughn considered his words carefully. The Federation's offer isn't really an offer of alliance, not first. It's an offer of help, finding a way home, finding your crew if they came through with you, understanding what happened to you well enough to maybe reverse it. If, along the way, you want to help us against the Dominion, that would be your choice, not a condition. But I won't pretend the war doesn't shape everything right now. I won't pretend we don't need help too. I just don't think that need should be the reason you choose anything. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, Observation Haki humming faintly at the edges of his awareness, reading something in both of them that went deeper than the words being said. The specific, bone-deep exhaustion of two governments worn thin by a war that had clearly been grinding both sides down far longer than either wanted to admit. Can I ask you guys something? He said finally. Of course, Zera said. This war, the Dominion, why are you even fighting them? It was Rethet, unexpectedly, who answered. The first time she'd spoken directly to Luffy since the hangar bay. Because they don't believe in anything but conquest. And because if we stop fighting, they don't stop coming. They tried to erase entire governments that resisted them. Mine included, more than once. Luffy's eyes flicked to her, something settling behind them. Recognition, maybe, of a soldier who'd actually lived the thing she was describing rather than reciting it. That's different from what I thought you'd say. What did you expect? Something about territory, or resources, or pride? Something political? Luffy shrugged. That's people trying not to get stepped on. I get that. He stood, brushing dust off his shorts, and looked between Vaughn and Zera with an expression that had, somewhere in the last several minutes, hardened into something resembling actual decision. Here's the thing, he said. I'm not picking a side because one of you offered me a better deal. I don't care about your war. Not really, not yet. No offense, it's just not my war. But those guys who showed up here today, the ones with the funny gray skin and the guns, his jaw set, something old and cold moving behind his eyes. They didn't come here to talk. They came here to test me like I was a weapon on a shelf. And then they were gonna decide whether to take me or break me. I don't like being tested. I really don't like people who think they get to decide what I'm for. So you'll help us, Zera said, carefully, not quite believing it yet. I'll help whoever's actually trying to stop people like that, Luffy said. Whoever that ends up being, section by section, fight by fight. Doesn't mean I'm anybody's soldier. Doesn't mean I won't walk away if either of you turn out to be the same kind of trouble as those Jem'Hadar guys. He grinned, the earlier warmth returning, but with a harder edge underneath it now. But for now, yeah, I'll stick around. Partly 'cause I want to find a way home, and partly 'cause the grin widened into something genuinely dangerous. Those Dominion guys made this personal, and where I'm from, personal doesn't go unanswered. Vaughn and Zera exchanged a glance. Two career officers, two governments at war with each other's ideologies as much as they were both at war with the Dominion, both quietly recalculating what it meant to have just watched a teenager with an unclassifiable power set choose, essentially, to become a variable neither side fully controlled. Then let's discuss logistics, Zahra said. Before Central Command and Starfleet Command finish arguing over jurisdiction, and someone above our heads makes a worse decision than the one we just agreed to. Far across the sector, in the golden-lit chamber where founders conferred in the liquid, shifting privacy of their natural forms, Weyoun 7 delivered his report with the same unshaken pleasantness he brought to every briefing, whether the news was triumph or catastrophe. First Nica's assessment, combined with sensor telemetry from the engagement, suggests the subject possesses at minimum 3 distinct combat registers, Weyoun said, reciting from memory rather than his pad, having long since internalized the report's contents. A baseline state capable of absorbing sustained disruptor fire with only superficial injury. An accelerated state, the Jem'Hadar, are calling it his second gear, rather charmingly, which multiplies his speed and striking force several-fold, at what appears to be a physiological cost he is willing to pay. And founder, most concerning of all, restraint. He fought 4 Jem'Hadar to unconsciousness, and chose, deliberately, not to kill a single one. You consider mercy a threat, the founder said, her voice a low murmur through the golden mist. I consider it evidence of reserves, founder. A being who fights that far below his ceiling and still wins so completely is not showing us his true capability. He is showing us exactly as much as he judged necessary to make a point, and stopping there. Weyoun's smile thinned, just slightly, the closest thing to genuine unease the Vorta genome permitted. The Cardassians and the Federation have apparently reached an arrangement to share custody of him. I would advise, founder, against a second direct engagement until we understand considerably more about what we're facing. The Jem'Hadar are proud. They are not reckless with information like this. First Ninnick's report was, if anything, understated. The golden mist stirred, thoughtful, ancient patience weighing options that span centuries rather than days. Then we will not fight him yet, Weyoun. We will study him. Every faction in this quadrant is now circling the same variable. Let them exhaust themselves discovering his limits for us. When the moment comes that he is needed, or that he must be removed, the Dominion will already know precisely how. A patient strategy, founder, Weyoun said, bowing. The only kind that has ever worked, the founder replied, and the golden light dimmed as the audience ended, leaving Weyoun alone with the quiet, familiar thrill of serving something far larger and far more patient than any war a lesser power could imagine winning quickly. Behind him, unnoticed by anyone in that chamber, the true shape of the coming months was already settling into place, a straw-hatted variable neither Empire nor Dominion fully understood yet, choosing sides not out of loyalty, but out of a code, carried whole and unbroken across the gulf between 2 universes, about to be tested by a quadrant that had never once, in all its long history of war, faced an opponent quite like him. The Joint Operations Agreement, hammered out over 6 tense hours between Starfleet Command, Cardassian Central Command, and 2 officers on the ground who were increasingly convinced their superiors were arguing about jurisdiction more than they were thinking about the actual threat, was, in the end, deliberately narrow. Luffy would remain aboard the Bellerophon, nominally under Federation protection, with Cardassian liaison officers granted standing access and joint operational authority whenever Union territory or Union intelligence was involved. Neither side got him. Both sides got enough. It satisfied no one completely, which Vaughn privately considered the sign of a workable compromise. What it did not account for, what no amount of diplomatic maneuvering between exhausted admirals and proud gulls could have accounted for, was the sheer logistical chaos of housing someone whose baseline caloric requirements, as the Bellerophon's medical officer discovered over the following week, ran at roughly 4 times a standard human's. I'm not saying it's impossible, Dr. Aisha Reyes said, standing in her sickbay office with a pad full of data that made less sense the longer she stared at it, addressing Vaughn and T'Preth with the particular weariness of a physician who'd spent a week reverse engineering a biology that refused to behave. I'm saying his cellular metabolism doesn't map to anything in our medical database, human or otherwise. His muscle density fluctuates depending on what he calls his gears, actual structural changes, not just adrenaline response. His skin, under a microscope, reads less like organic tissue and more like some kind of engineered elastomer that happens to also be alive. And Captain, this is the part that's actually kept me up the last 3 nights. There's something in his blood chemistry that doesn't match any biological process I can identify. A kind of energy signature. It flares when he's under stress. It flares more when he's angry. Haki, Vaughn said, recalling the term from his last conversation with Luffy. He mentioned it, some kind of spiritual energy, near as I can translate the concept. 3 types, he said. 1 lets him sense danger and intention. 1 he uses to harden his body. And a 3rd. Vaughn paused, remembering the odd, almost reluctant way Luffy had described it. 1 he was less willing to talk about. Whatever it is, Reyes said, it's not something our tricorders were built to quantify. I've had to write custom diagnostic subroutines just to get baseline readings, and even those keep drifting out of calibration whenever he's nearby. It's not interference exactly. It's more like, she searched for the word, like being near him changes what the instruments consider normal. T'Preth, who had spent the week compiling behavioral and tactical data with the same meticulous patience she brought to everything, offered her own assessment without prompting. I have reviewed the recovered sensor logs from the Jem'Hadar engagement extensively, Captain. There is a pattern worth noting. His combat efficiency increased measurably over the course of the fight, not merely through the deployment of his gear second state, but through observable tactical adaptation. He adjusted his approach against each successive opponent based on data gathered from the previous exchange. This is consistent with an extremely experienced combatant, not merely a powerful one. How experienced are we talking? Vaughn asked. Based on scar tissue analysis Dr. Reyes conducted during his initial medical scan and his own account of his history, I would estimate several years of near-continuous high-intensity combat beginning in his early teens. T'Preth's tone remained perfectly level, but something in the pause before her next sentence suggested even a Vulcan found the data faintly unsettling. He is, by any reasonable metric, a veteran. He simply does not carry himself like one. Vaughn thought of Luffy's easy grin, his genuine delight over replicated meat, his casual, guileless questions about swimming and starships, and whether Starfleet had a version of what he called Sea Kings. He thought, too, of the cold, old thing that had moved behind the boy's eyes in the seconds before he'd faced down First Ninnik, a fraction of a second where 19 or 20 years old had briefly looked a great deal older. No, Vaughn agreed quietly, he doesn't. Luffy, blissfully unaware that he was currently the subject of 3 separate medical and tactical analyses running in parallel across the ship, had spent the week doing what he always did in unfamiliar territory, exploring, eating everything that wasn't nailed down, and making friends with anyone who'd hold still long enough. He'd charmed most of engineering within 2 days, mostly by asking Chief Engineer Oseze Kell an endless stream of increasingly specific questions about how warp cores worked, questions that started as pure curiosity and ended, disconcertingly, with Luffy offering genuinely useful structural suggestions based on nothing but instinct and a lifetime of watching Frankie build increasingly absurd machinery. That's, Kell had stared at the diagnostic display Luffy had just pointed at. That's actually a legitimate stress point. How did you know that? Dunno, just looked wrong. Luffy shrugged. My friend Frankie builds stuff. I've picked up some things by watching him yell at people who mess with his work. He'd made fast friends with most of the ship's junior officers, who found his complete lack of pretense refreshing after a war that had ground most of the crew's optimism down to something thin and careful. He'd made a considerably slower, more cautious friendship with T'Preth, who found his questions about Vulcan philosophy genuinely interesting once she got past her initial assessment that he was, in her words, tactically unserious in casual conversation and disturbingly serious in combat, with no apparent transitional state between the two. And he'd spent increasing amounts of time with Ensign Corrigan, who had, somewhat to his own surprise, become something like Luffy's primary point of contact on the ship, less because of rank or assignment, and more because Luffy had simply decided, the way he decided most things, that Corrigan was someone worth knowing. "You handled that Jem'Hadar thing pretty well," Luffy told him, the two of them sitting in the mess hall on the 6th day, Luffy working through a plate stacked improbably high with replicated protein. "For someone who looked like he was gonna pass out." "I nearly did pass out," Corrigan admitted. "I've never seen anything like that. None of us have. There's not exactly a Starfleet Academy course on what to do when a teenager punches 4 Jem'Hadar unconscious with his bare, extremely elastic hands." Luffy laughed, loud and genuine. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Even back home, most people freak out the first time they see devil fruit stuff. You get used to it." "Do you?" Corrigan asked, more seriously than he'd intended. "Get used to it, I mean. The fighting. Everything that happened back there looked like it wasn't the first time for you." Luffy's chewing slowed. For a moment, the easy humor dimmed, replaced by something quieter, more considered. The same shift Vaughn had noticed, the goofy exterior peeling back to something older underneath. "You don't really get used to it," Luffy said finally. "You just get better at deciding when it's worth it. There's a lot of people who've tried to hurt my friends, or take stuff that wasn't theirs, or just be cruel, because they could, because nobody strong enough had told them no yet." His hand tightened slightly around his fork. "Somebody's gotta be the one who tells them no. I decided a long time ago that was gonna be me, whenever I could manage it." "That's a heavy thing to decide at. How old are you exactly?" 19. Luffy grinned again, the weight lifting as quickly as it had settled, like a cloud passing over the sun. "Don't look so sad about it. I like being that guy. Somebody's gotta, right? Might as well be somebody who's strong enough to actually pull it off and have fun doing it." Corrigan didn't have a response for that. Not a quick one, anyway. And the two of them sat in companionable silence for a while, the low hum of the mess hall's replicators and the quiet murmur of off-duty crew filling the space where words might otherwise have gone. It was Corrigan, eventually, who broke the silence, glancing toward the viewport where stars slid past in the particular, hypnotic slowness of impulse cruise. "Do you think you'll find your crew? Your friends, I mean. The ones you keep mentioning." Luffy's eyes followed the stars for a long moment. "I have to," he said simply. "Not think. Have to. Doesn't matter how long it takes, or what I gotta do to make it happen. That's the whole plan. Find a way, or make one." He looked back at Corrigan, grin returning, but something steady and absolute underneath it now. The kind of certainty that didn't require volume to be convincing. "I've never once given up on something I decided I wanted. Not gonna start with this." The moment that changed everything came 8 days into the joint custody arrangement, delivered not through diplomatic channels or intelligence reports, but through the blunt, unglamorous medium of a long-range sensor sweep conducted as part of routine Federation border monitoring along a sector the Bellerophon had drifted toward while awaiting further orders. T'Preth found Vaughn in his ready room, pad in hand, expression carrying the particular stillness that, on a Vulcan, indicated something significant. "Captain, I believe you'll want to see this personally." Vaughn took the pad, scanning the sensor telemetry, a debris field several light years out, well beyond any charted shipping lane. radiating a subspace signature that matched, disturbingly closely, the readings logged during Luffy's initial arrival. Another rift, Vaughn said slowly. A residual signature, more precisely. Consistent with the theoretical model our science division has been developing to explain the subject's arrival. A transient subspace temporal fracture, self-sealing, extraordinarily rare in recorded Federation history. T'Preth's voice remained level, but there was something almost eager underneath the careful Vulcan restraint. The debris field itself, Captain, is the significant element. Preliminary long-range scans indicate wreckage consistent with a wooden seafaring vessel. Vaughn's head came up sharply. Wooden? Yes, Captain. Not merely wood-paneled, in the manner of certain ceremonial or antique vessels. The hull composition itself. There are also several smaller fragments showing evidence of what our sensors classify, tentatively, as biological-technological hybridization. Mechanisms that do not correspond to any known engineering principle in our databases. T'Preth paused, the closest thing to hesitation Vaughn had seen from her in years of service together. Captain, given the subject's account of his origin, a seafaring vessel, a crew, companions with what he describes as similarly unconventional abilities, I believe there is a statistically significant probability this debris field represents wreckage from the same point of origin as our guest. Vaughn was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications, weighing what it would mean to bring this information to a boy who had spent 8 days holding himself together through sheer force of optimism and stubborn refusal to consider the alternative. Does he know? Vaughn asked. Not yet, Captain. I felt it prudent to confirm the data was reliable before. Get me a full sensor sweep of that debris field, Vaughn said, already standing. Full resolution, every fragment catalogued. And T'Preth, I want to be the one who tells him. Not a report, not a briefing. Me. He found Luffy exactly where he usually was at this hour. In the observation lounge, nose nearly pressed against the viewport, watching the stars with the same undimmed fascination he'd shown every day since arriving, as if the universe hadn't yet run out of ways to surprise him. Hey, Captain, Luffy said without turning, catching Vaughn's reflection in the transparent aluminum. You look like you got something to tell me. Good something or bad something. Vaughn hesitated. A lifetime of command training telling him to lead with caveats, with uncertainty, with the careful hedging that protected both the messenger and the listener from false hope. He decided, looking at the boy's open, waiting expression, that Luffy deserved better than hedging. We found something, Vaughn said. A debris field, a few light years out. Wreckage that doesn't match anything in our records. Wood construction, mixed with technology we can't identify. It's consistent with the kind of vessel you've described. Your ship. For a long moment, Luffy didn't move, didn't speak. The easy, constant motion that seemed to define him, the fidgeting, the grinning, the restless energy of a body that rarely sat fully still, simply stopped, entirely, his eyes fixed on Vaughn, with an intensity that made the captain understand, all at once and completely, exactly how much weight had been sitting behind that easy grin for the past 8 days. You're sure? Luffy's voice was very quiet. I'm not sure of anything yet. It could be debris from something else entirely. This quadrant is old, and strange things drift through it. But the composition matches what you've described closely enough that I thought you deserved to know immediately, rather than waiting for a confirmed report. Luffy turned back to the viewport, staring out at the stars with an expression Vaughn had no reference for. Not quite hope, not quite fear. Something raw and unguarded that the boy usually kept carefully hidden behind humor and hunger and easy conversation. My crew, he said, very softly, more to himself than to Vaughn. If any part of that's really them. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I want to go there, Luffy said, turning back. and the softness was gone now, replaced by something hard and absolute. The same certainty Corrigan had glimpsed in the mess hall days earlier. Now, however fast this ship goes, I want to go there right now. I understand, Vaughn said. I'll have T'Preth plot the fastest safe course. But Luffy, he chose his next words with care. I need you to be prepared for the possibility that whatever we find isn't what you're hoping for. The debris field alone tells us something significant happened. It doesn't tell us whether anyone survived it. Luffy's jaw tightened, the grin nowhere in evidence now, replaced by something Vaughn recognized instantly from every fighting man and woman he'd ever served alongside. The specific, controlled fury of someone choosing, deliberately, not to consider the worst possibility until they had no choice left but to face it. They're alive, Luffy said, with the flat, unshakable certainty of a man who had decided, somewhere deep in the core of himself, that the alternative simply wasn't an option he was willing to entertain. They have to be. We're not done yet. There's still too much left to do. He turned back to the viewport, hands curling into fists against the transparent aluminum, staring out at the distant point in space where an answer, one way or another, was waiting for him. How long till we get there? He asked. At maximum warp, 4 days. Then let's go, Luffy said. 4 days. I can wait 4 days. Something in his voice suggested it would be the longest 4 days of his life. 4 days at maximum warp gave the Bellerophon time to prepare in ways that had little to do with engines, and everything to do with the boy pacing its corridors like a caged storm. Vaughn had seen grief before. He'd seen anticipation and fear, and the particular restlessness of officers waiting on news from home during a war that made every subspace delay feel like an eternity. What he watched unfold over those 4 days was something else. Luffy alternating between manic bursts of energy, sparring against holographic constructs in the ship's gymnasium until the safety protocols had to be adjusted twice, and long stretches of silence where he simply sat in the observation lounge, watching the stars streak past, saying nothing at all. Dr. Reyes flagged it in her log as a concerning behavioral pattern. T'Preth, with characteristic bluntness, called it exactly what it was in a private conversation with Vaughn. He is grieving in advance, Captain, while simultaneously refusing to permit himself to grieve at all. It is not a sustainable psychological posture. I would recommend intervention, except I am uncertain what intervention would look like for a species we do not understand, experiencing a crisis this quadrant has no precedent for. He simply made sure someone checked on Luffy regularly, made sure Corrigan, who had, without any formal assignment, become something like the boy's closest friend aboard the ship, spent time with him when the silence stretched too long, and otherwise let the countdown run its course, because there was nothing else to be done. On the morning of the 4th day, the Bellerophon dropped out of warp at the edge of the debris field, and Luffy was on the bridge before the ship had fully settled into standard orbit, close enough to the main view screen that Vaughn had to gently redirect him to an actual station. Report, Vaughn said, taking his chair, watching Luffy's reflection in the screen rather than the screen itself for a moment, gauging. Confirmed debris field, Captain, the tactical officer reported. Sensor resolutions considerably clearer at this range. We're reading approximately 40 distinct fragments of significant size, consistent with a single vessel destroyed by... She paused, frowning at her readout. That's strange. The damage pattern isn't consistent with weapons fire. It reads more like a structural failure, catastrophic, but not violent in the way an attack would be. Meaning? Vaughn asked. Meaning something broke the ship apart from a stress event, not a battle. Could be a subspace shear during transit through whatever rift brought it here. Could be something else. She looked up. Captain, I'm also reading residual biological traces on several of the larger fragments. Old, faint, not recent. Luffy's hands had gone white-knuckled on the edge of the console he was gripping. How old? The officer glanced at Vaughn, who nodded permission. Weeks, best estimate. Possibly longer. The readings are degraded. But Captain, if there were survivors, they didn't stay with the wreckage. There's no life sign contact of any kind in the debris field itself. Something in Luffy's shoulders eased fractionally. Not relief, not yet, but the absence of the worst possible confirmation. That's good, he said, quiet and urgent. That means they got off the ship. That means they're somewhere. It's possible, Vaughn said carefully. It's also possible the fragments simply degraded past detection over time. Or that they got off the ship, Luffy said again, harder this time. And Vaughn recognized the tone well enough by now not to argue with it. This wasn't a boy in denial. This was a boy choosing, deliberately and with his whole will, which version of an uncertain reality he intended to fight for. I need to see it myself. The wreckage. Can we get closer? We can send a shuttle in for a closer survey, Vaughn said. It'll be safer than trying to bring the Bellerophon directly through the field. I'm going, Luffy. I'm going, Captain. There was no anger in it, just absolute, immovable certainty. That might be my ship out there, my home. I'm not looking at it through a view screen from a safe distance. Vaughn studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, T'Preth. You're with him. Corrigan. You as well. He trusts you. And I want a friendly face on that shuttle. He looked back to Luffy. We do this carefully. Whatever's out there, we treat it with the respect it deserves. Luffy's jaw tightened, something raw moving behind his eyes. Yeah, he said quietly. It deserves that much. The shuttle threaded through the debris field with the slow, careful precision of a pilot who understood exactly how much this mattered to the passenger, sitting rigid in the seat behind her. Luffy pressed close to the viewport, eyes tracking every fragment that drifted past. Twisted timber, scorched planking, a piece of curved hull that might once have been part of something's prow. Then he went very still. Stop, he said. Stop here. The pilot brought the shuttle to a careful hover. Outside, tumbling slowly in the vacuum, was a fragment larger than the others. A section of railing, ornately carved, and attached to it, miraculously intact despite everything, a figurehead. The weathered wooden face of a lion, mouth open in an eternal cheerful roar, paint long since scoured away by exposure but the shape unmistakable. That's... Luffy's voice cracked, just slightly. That's the Sunny. That's really the Sunny. Corrigan, seated beside him, said nothing. Simply put a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder as Luffy pressed both palms flat against the viewport, staring at the wreckage of his home with an expression that finally, after 4 days of careful, deliberate control, cracked open into something raw and unguarded. They made it off, he said, more to himself than anyone else, voice thick. They had to. Frankie built her strong enough that whatever broke her apart, everybody had time to get clear. They're okay. They're okay somewhere. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cool, transparent aluminum, eyes closed. I just gotta find where. T'Preth, from the pilot's seat, spoke with unusual gentleness for a Vulcan delivering data. Luffy, I'm detecting a faint residual energy signature embedded in the wreckage itself. Not decay, not damage, something deliberately left behind. It may be worth investigating before we return to the Bellerophon. That got through where nothing else had. Luffy's head came up immediately, eyes sharp again. Left behind? Like a message? I cannot yet determine its nature. It could be a message. It could be residual technology. I recommend a careful approach. The shuttle drifted closer, and as it did, the source resolved on sensors. A small, sealed container, roughly the size of a chest, lodged among the wreckage, radiating a faint, steady energy signature, entirely unlike anything else in the debris field. Corrigan, running the analysis himself now, felt his breath catch. Captain, he caught himself. T'Preth, This container's shielded, deliberately, and recently, relative to the rest of the wreckage. Someone built this to survive whatever happened to the ship. Bring it aboard, Luffy said immediately. Carefully, please. The retrieval took 11 careful minutes, the shuttle's tractor beam guiding the container through the airlock with painstaking precision, while Luffy watched, hands clenched, breath held. When it finally settled onto the shuttle's deck, he was on his knees beside it before Corrigan could even suggest caution. Luffy, we should scan it first. Make sure it's from my ship. Luffy's hands hovered over the container's seal, some old, worn mechanism that looked nothing like Cardassian or Federation engineering. Hand-forged metal, etched with symbols that meant nothing to Corrigan or to Preth, but that Luffy's face lit up at recognizing instantly. This is Frankie's work. He built fail-safes into everything. If he made this, it's because he wanted it found. He popped the seal. Inside, nestled in careful padding, sat a single data recorder. Den Mushi technology, a small snail-shaped device that looked almost comically out of place amid the sleek Federation shuttle interior, alongside a folded piece of oilskin-wrapped paper and what looked, unmistakably, like a small preserved portion of food, sealed tight against decay. Luffy stared at the food for a long moment, throat working, before he carefully set it aside and picked up the paper instead, unfolding it with hands that weren't quite steady. The handwriting, when Corrigan glimpsed it over his shoulder, meant nothing to him. Some script utterly unlike anything in Federation records. But he watched Luffy's face as he read it, watched relief and grief, and something fiercely, brilliantly hopeful all crash through the boy's expression in rapid succession. They're alive, Luffy said, and this time his voice broke completely. Tears he'd been holding back for 4 days, finally spilling over, as he laughed and cried in the same breath. Nami's handwriting. She left coordinates, not exact. She couldn't have known exactly where the ship would end up, but a search pattern, the way we always did when we got separated in a storm. They're alive. They made it off, and they're looking for me the same way I'm looking for them. He clutched the paper to his chest, shoulders shaking, and for a moment, just a moment, 19 years old looked exactly as young as it actually was. All the careful, practiced strength stripped away to something achingly human underneath. Then, slowly, he wiped his face, straightened, and the grin returned. Different now, sharper, lit with a purpose that hadn't been there 4 days ago. To Preth, he said, voice steadying with each word. Can your ship read this? The coordinates, I mean. Can you figure out where they'd actually be based on what Nami wrote? Preth took the paper carefully, photographing the script with her tricorder. I can attempt a translation and cross-reference with known stellar cartography. I cannot promise accuracy given the difference in navigational conventions. That's fine. That's more than I had an hour ago. Luffy pressed the paper against his chest one more time before folding it carefully back into the oilskin wrapping. They're out there. They're looking. All I gotta do now is meet them halfway. He looked out at the wreckage of the Sunny one last time, the broken lion figurehead tumbling slowly through the void, weathered and scarred but unmistakably, defiantly still itself, and something settled in his expression, some private vow being renewed. Thank you, he said quietly, to the ship, to the crew who'd built it, to whatever stubborn miracle had kept them alive long enough to leave this behind. I'm coming, just hold on a little longer. Back aboard the Bellerophon, Vaughn received the shuttle's report with a complex tangle of relief and renewed urgency. Relief that Luffy's crew appeared to have survived. Urgency at what it meant for the mission going forward. A search for scattered survivors across unknown coordinates, in a quadrant already primed with Dominion, Cardassian and Federation interest in the boy at its center, was not a simple undertaking. But watching Luffy stride back onto the bridge, red-eyed but standing taller than Vaughn had seen him stand in 8 days, purpose blazing where uncertainty had sat before. Vaughn understood something had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a story about a stranded boy waiting to be helped home. This was a rescue mission now, and Luffy intended to lead it. "Captain," Luffy said, and there was something in his voice Van hadn't heard before. Not the easy warmth, not the sharp readiness for a fight, but something that fused both together into pure, focused resolve. "I need your help finding some coordinates, and after that, I need your help getting there faster than anything in this quadrant thinks is possible. Because somewhere out there, my crew's doing the exact same thing I am, looking for a way back to each other. And I'm not going to make them wait longer than they have to." Vaughn found himself, despite the war grinding on beyond every viewport, despite the Dominion's shadow already lengthening over everything that had happened this past week, genuinely smiling. "Then let's find them," he said, and gave the order that would send the Bellerophon, and everyone aboard her, into the next, considerably larger chapter of a story the quadrant was only beginning to understand it had become part of. T'Preth's translation of Nami's coordinates took the better part of 2 days, and even then arrived hedged with more qualifications than Luffy had patience for. The script uses a positional reference system built around landmarks I cannot independently verify. She refers to something called a log pose several times, a navigational instrument that appears to calibrate against localized magnetic fields rather than fixed stellar coordinates. T'Preth's brow furrowed over the pad, an expression that on anyone else would have been mild frustration, and on her registered as genuine scientific fascination, fighting against professional caution. Translated into our stellar cartography, the best I can produce is a probability field, a region roughly 11 light-years across, within which her intended search pattern likely falls. "I cannot give you an exact point, Luffy. I'm sorry. 11 light-years isn't nothing," Luffy said. But there was no real disappointment in it, just the restless energy of a man converting frustration directly into forward motion. "That's smaller than somewhere in space, right? We can search that. It would take considerable time with conventional methods," T'Preth said. However, and here, for the first time since Vaughn had come to know her, something like genuine excitement crept into her voice. "I've cross-referenced the probability field against recent long-range sensor sweeps conducted by Federation outposts along the DMZ. There are 3 anomalous contact reports within the search area over the past 6 days. Unregistered vessels, non-standard configurations, exhibiting flight behavior inconsistent with anything in our database." Luffy was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. "Show me." The first report, logged by a Federation listening post near a contested border world, described a vessel resembling nothing in Starfleet's configuration database, moving with erratic, non-Newtonian propulsion, consistent with no known drive system, that had been briefly detected before vanishing from sensors entirely. The second, from a civilian trader, described something similar with an addendum that made Luffy laugh out loud despite himself. The trader had reported the vessel appeared to be actively engaged in what witnesses described as combat against a significantly larger hostile ship, and won. "That's them," Luffy said, grinning so hard it looked like it hurt. "That's absolutely them. Nobody else picks fights that stupid and wins." The third report, T'Preth continued, is somewhat more concerning. A Cardassian border patrol logged brief contact with an unregistered vessel matching similar characteristics 3 days ago, in a system currently under contested control between Union forces and a Dominion-aligned faction. The patrol did not pursue. The system in question has seen increased military activity in recent days. Vaughn, listening from his command chair, felt the familiar cold settle back into his stomach. Which system? Designated Cardassian records as the Trevian system. Sparsely populated, 3 inhabited worlds, currently a contested flashpoint in the ongoing conflict. So, if Luffy's crew is anywhere in that 11 light-year field, Vaughn said slowly, the most likely confirmed sighting puts them directly in the middle of an active war zone. That is the most probable interpretation of the available data, yes. Luffy's grin didn't fade. Exactly. But something harder slid underneath it. Then that's where we're going. Luffy, Vaughn said carefully. The Trevian system is dangerous for reasons that have nothing to do with your crew's ability to handle themselves. It's a genuine war zone. Dominion forces, Cardassian resistance, possibly Federation assets depending on how the fronts shifted in the last 72 hours. If we go in with a single starship, then we go in careful, Luffy said. But we go in. Captain, I get that you're worried about your ship, your crew, the war. All of that's real. I'm not saying it isn't. But you're talking about caution for a system my friends might currently be stuck in the middle of a battle inside. I've spent 8 days being patient. I'm not going to spend a 9th being patient while Zoro and Sanji and everybody else are fighting through something they don't understand, in a place they don't understand, waiting on me to show up. Vaughn studied him for a long moment, the same calculation he'd been running for over a week now, weighing caution against the particular, absolute certainty this boy operated with, a certainty that had, so far, been right more often than Vaughn's own careful instincts. All right, Vaughn said finally. We go, but we go smart. To Preth, plot a course that keeps us out of direct sensor range until we have better intelligence on the current disposition of forces in system. I am not flying a Federation starship blind into a war zone, not even for this. Understood, Captain. And Luffy, Vaughn's voice carried a weight that made the boy actually pause. If your crew really is anywhere near that system, and this war has genuinely spilled over onto them, I need you to understand something. They may not be the only innocent people caught in that crossfire. There will be Cardassian civilians there, possibly Federation personnel. If it comes to a fight, I need you fighting with an eye toward everyone in that system, not just the people you came for. Something flickered across Luffy's face. Not offense, Vaughn noted, but consideration, genuine and immediate, the same quick moral calculus that had made him spare First Ninek's squad instead of ending them. Yeah, Luffy said finally. Okay, that's fair. That's actually exactly how my crew would want me to handle it anyway. His grin returned, sharper now, ready. Let's go get 'em, Captain, and anybody else who needs getting. Gulzera, informed of the Trevian development through the joint intelligence channel the agreement had established, arrived at her own conclusions with characteristic speed and considerably less sentiment. The Trevian system, she said over the secure channel, her image sharp and unreadable on the Bellerophon's view screen, has been a Union priority for the last 11 days, Captain. We have a resistance cell embedded on the 3rd planet, feeding us intelligence on Dominion troop movements along that stretch of the front. If your missing crew has genuinely made planetfall there, they've walked into one of the most heavily contested pieces of territory in this sector. Then perhaps, Vaughn said, this is an opportunity for exactly the kind of cooperation our arrangement was designed for. A pause, calculating. You're suggesting a joint operation. I'm suggesting that if Luffy's crew are half as capable as everything we've learned about him suggests, they may already be inadvertently disrupting Dominion operations in that system. That's an asset to the Union whether or not you ever formally claim it. And if they need extraction, a joint Federation Cardassian task force gets them out faster and safer than either of us going in alone. Another pause, longer this time. When Zera spoke again, there was something almost like genuine respect threaded through her clipped tone. You've become quite the advocate for this arrangement, Captain. I confess I didn't expect that, given how reluctantly the Federation entered it. I've spent 8 days watching a 19-year-old hold himself together through sheer stubbornness while looking for people he loves, Vaughn said simply. I'd like to help him find them before that stubbornness runs out. I think that's worth more to this alliance than any tactical advantage he represents. Zara's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Sentiment, Captain. I did warn you it was a luxury. She paused, then added, with something that might have been genuine warmth beneath the Cardassian formality. I'll authorize joint operational access to our resistance network in system. Glyn Rethet has requested assignment to the operation personally. She's developed something of a professional fascination with your guest, and frankly, her instincts in that hangar bay were better than mine. Use her. And Captain, bring them out alive, whoever and whatever they turn out to be. This quadrant has consumed enough young soldiers for one war. It doesn't need to consume a boy's entire family too. 3 sectors away, in the golden chamber where patience wore the shape of ancient certainty, Weyoun 7 delivered his latest report with the particular relish of a man who'd correctly predicted exactly this outcome. The subject is moving toward the Trevelyan system, Founder. Our intelligence suggests his search is connected to unidentified vessel contacts reported in the region over the past week. Vessels our own forward observers have already flagged as anomalous. Weyoun's smile carried an edge of genuine anticipation now. If these contacts represent additional individuals from his origin point, companions as he apparently calls them, the Dominion stands to gain considerably more than a single unpredictable variable. We may be looking at an entire cohort of comparable capability, converging on a system already critical to our Western Front. The golden mist coiled, considering. You believe this presents opportunity. I believe, Founder, that a straw-hatted boy fighting alone is dangerous. A straw-hatted boy reunited with however many companions share even a fraction of his capability. Weyoun spread his hands. Represents either the single greatest threat this war has yet produced, or, if properly managed, the single greatest asset. I would recommend we do considerably more than observe this time. First Ninix's unit has recovered fully, and requests permission to redeploy, with reinforcement, ahead of the Bellerophon's likely arrival. And if this cohort proves as resistant to Jem'Hadar force as the boy alone did, then, Founder, Weyoun said, bowing with the particular grace of a man who had already war-gamed every branch of this conversation several times over, we will have learned precisely how large a problem we're facing before it has the chance to become larger still. Better to test the full measure of this threat in a system we already contest, than to discover it unprepared in one that matters more. The Founder's not-quite face remained unreadable in the shifting gold light, but her voice, when it came, carried the weight of a decision already, quietly, made. Send them, Weyoun, but remind First Ninec, I want information this time, not merely a demonstration. If there truly is a cohort of these beings converging on Trevelyan, I want to know everything about them before this war decides whether they are weapons worth taking, or threats worth ending. Of course, Founder. Weyoun's smile widened, patient and pleased, as somewhere far across the sector, a Federation starship carrying a straw-hatted boy and his unshakable hope bent its course toward a war zone that was, unbeknownst to everyone aboard, no longer merely a contested front, but the opening stage of the very collision the Dominion had been quietly, patiently waiting to provoke. The Trevelyan system announced itself long before the Bellerophon dropped out of warp near its outer markers, not through sensor contact but through the particular, ugly texture of subspace itself, roiled and scarred by weeks of sustained military engagement, the kind of interference that made T'Preth's normally serene console readouts flicker with static she clearly found personally offensive. Passive sensors only, Vaughn ordered, settling into his chair with the weight of a man who'd flown into contested space more times than he cared to count. I want a full picture of what's happening in this system before anyone knows we're here. The picture, when it resolved, was grim. Trevelyan 3, the resistance world Zara had mentioned, sat under what could only be described as a rolling siege. Dominion picket ships maintaining a loose but lethal blockade around the planet's orbital approaches. Cardassian resistance vessels running the gauntlet in small, fast groups whenever they dared, and scattered debris fields marking where that gambit had, more than once, failed catastrophically. Population estimate on Trevian 3, Tepreth, approximately 400,000, Captain. Predominantly Cardassian colonists, with a significant Bajoran refugee population that settled there following the occupation's end. Resistance intelligence suggests the Dominion blockade is intended to starve the planet into surrender rather than risk a costly ground assault. The world's terrain apparently favors defenders. Luffy, standing at the edge of the bridge with his arms crossed, had gone very quiet. The particular quiet Vaughn had learned to recognize as the boy processing something that mattered enormously and required, for once, actual restraint rather than immediate action. 400,000 people, Luffy said finally. Being starved out. That's... He stopped, jaw tight. That's not a war. That's just cruelty with extra steps. It's both, unfortunately, Vaughn said. That's often how wars actually look, up close. Less clean than anyone wants to admit. Do you have anything on the vessel contacts? Luffy asked. The ones that matched. One moment. Tepreth's fingers moved rapidly over her console, cross-referencing incoming sensor data against the anomalous signature profile they'd built from the earlier reports. Captain, I have a contact. Small vessel, non-standard configuration. Currently engaged with a Jem'Hadar attack ship at the edge of the blockade perimeter. The flight pattern is... She paused, something almost like disbelief creeping into her tone. The flight pattern is highly irregular. The vessel appears to be deliberately outmaneuvering a significantly more powerful opponent through means that don't correspond to any conventional propulsion physics. Luffy was across the bridge before she finished speaking, close enough to the tactical display to nearly press his nose against it. Show me, please, just show me. The image resolved on the main view screen. A small ship, unmistakably the Going Merry's stylistic cousin. Smaller, sleeker, clearly built after whatever catastrophe had claimed the Sunny, but carrying the same unmistakable defiant character in its design. Weaving between disruptor fire from a Jem'Hadar attack ship, 3 times its size, moving in ways that made no aerodynamic or inertial sense whatsoever. That's a coup de burst, Luffy breathed, something between a laugh and a sob catching in his throat. That's Frankie's work, that's... He must have rebuilt something after the wreck. That's exactly the kind of stupid, brilliant thing he'd do. Captain, Tepreth said urgently. The Jem'Hadar vessel is closing. Their weapons are at full power. The small vessel's evasive maneuvers are impressive, but I don't believe they can sustain this indefinitely against a ship of that class. Vaughn was already moving. Red alert. Helm. Best possible speed to intercept, and get me a firing solution on that Jem'Hadar vessel the moment we're in range. Tactical. Hail the small ship the second we're close enough. I want them to know we're friendly, before we're close enough to look like a second threat. Belay that, Luffy said. Every head on the bridge turned. Vaughn frowned. Excuse me? Don't hail them yet. Just get me close. Luffy's eyes hadn't left the view screen, tracking the smaller ship's desperate maneuvers with fierce, focused intensity. And when you're close enough, open an airlock, or a shuttle bay, whatever's fastest. I'm not waiting for an intercept course to finish plotting. Luffy, that ship's under heavy fire. If you're planning what I think you're planning, I've jumped into worse than this plenty of times. The grin that spread across Luffy's face now was different from anything Vaughn had seen from him yet. Pure, unrestrained joy. The specific delight of a man about to do something reckless and completely, unshakably right. Just get me close, Captain. I promise. This part I've got covered. Vaughn held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then made the only decision that had ever really been available to him since this boy walked, or rather, was carried, into his life 8 days ago. Helm, close to intercept range and hold position. Tactical, prepare to lay down covering fire the moment that Jem'Hadar vessel's shields are within our firing envelope. Luffy, he gestured toward the turbo lift. Shuttle bays this way. Go. Luffy was already running. Aboard the small, battered vessel currently earning every ounce of respect its erratic flight pattern demanded, Nami gripped the helm controls with white-knuckled precision, sweat beading despite the climate control, eyes flicking between 3 separate readouts that all agreed, unanimously, that they were about to die if something didn't change in the next 90 seconds. Frankie, I need more power to the burst thrusters. We've got maybe 2 more evasive windows before that thing gets a proper lock. Already redlining the coupling, Nami sis. Give me 30 seconds and I can squeeze out 1 more coup de burst. But after that, we're running on fumes and pure super stubbornness. Frankie's voice crackled over the ship's internal comm, strained but characteristically unbowed even mid-crisis. In the cargo hold, Zoro stood braced against a support strut, 3 swords drawn, radiating the particular, coiled stillness of a man who'd spent the last several minutes calculating exactly how he intended to board that attacking vessel and cut its crew down personally, if it came within 100 meters. Physics be damned. We should have stayed and fought from the start, he growled. We should have done a lot of things, Nami snapped back over the comm, but none of them involve a suicide boarding action against a ship with actual energy shields. So sit tight, Mosshead, and let me fly. Sanji, perched near the ship's small viewport with a cigarette he'd been chewing unlit for the better part of an hour. Real tobacco had run out 3 worlds ago, and this quadrant's replicated substitute tasted, in his professional opinion, like burnt cardboard, kept his voice deliberately light despite the tension radiating off every other member of the crew. Nami Swan, however this goes, I want it on record that I think you're doing beautifully. Now is not the time, Sanji. There's never a bad time to appreciate. Incoming, Frankie bellowed, and the ship lurched violently as another volley of disruptor fire clipped their shields, alarms shrieking through every deck. It was Chopper, small and terrified but resolutely at his post monitoring the ship's damage control systems, who spotted it first. Wait, Nami, there's another ship. Big one. It just appeared on the sensors. Enemy reinforcement? Zoro was already moving toward the bridge, sword drawn. I don't think so. The configuration's different. It's not matching anything we've logged from the aggressive ships. Nami's eyes flicked to her own display, catching the new contact just as it settled into position, considerably larger than their attacker. Weapons already tracking the Jem'Hadar vessel with lethal, unmistakable intent. They're targeting the ship chasing us, she said, disbelief coloring her voice. Whoever they are, the unknown vessel opened fire. Precise, coordinated bursts that staggered the Jem'Hadar attackers' shields in a way their own small ship's weapons had never come close to managing, buying them the exact breathing room Frankie needed. Now's my window. Frankie roared. Coup de burst. Brace for it. The ship lurched forward in a burst of raw propulsive force, putting hard distance between them and the staggering attacker. And in that moment of relative safety, every eye on the bridge turned toward the new arrival, the massive, unfamiliar vessel that had just, inexplicably, saved their lives. Hail them, Nami said, carefully. If they wanted us dead, they had a clean shot already. Before anyone could act on it, their own comm system crackled to life, not with a hail, but with something else entirely, a proximity alert, an object approaching their hull at a speed and trajectory that made absolutely no physical sense for anything without propulsion. What is that? Zoro said, already moving toward the source. Nami's eyes went wide as the trajectory resolved on her display. Not a projectile, not a shuttle, but something moving in an arc too deliberate, too controlled, too achingly, impossibly familiar to be anything but exactly what her instruments were telling her it couldn't possibly be. "No way," she breathed. "No, there's no way." The hull shuddered as something struck it, not with violence, but with the deliberate, controlled impact of someone who'd landed on considerably worse surfaces 1,000 times before. A moment later, the ship's exterior hatch, the one nobody had opened, the one that should have required proper docking clearance, simply peeled back, rubber fingers hooking under the seal and wrenching it open with casual, overwhelming strength. Luffy dropped through the opening, straw hat pressed firmly to his head with one hand, grinning so wide it looked like it might actually split his face in half. For one full second, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The bridge of the small, battered ship hung suspended, in a silence so complete it seemed to swallow even the lingering alarm klaxons. Then Nami screamed his name and was across the room before conscious thought caught up, throwing herself at him hard enough to nearly knock them both over, and the entire crew erupted at once. Chopper transforming mid-leap into his heavy point form and barreling into both of them. Sanji's cigarette falling forgotten from his mouth as he shouted something that was half laughter, half furious, relieved cursing. Frankie abandoning the engine room entirely to come thundering up the corridor bellowing Luffy's name loud enough to rattle the bulkheads. And Zoro, who never showed it, who never let anyone see it, standing frozen in the doorway for exactly one moment too long, before crossing the distance in 3 strides and pulling Luffy into a rough, one-armed embrace that said everything his voice, thick and rough, couldn't quite manage. "You absolute idiot!" Nami sobbed into Luffy's shoulder, fists pounding weakly against his chest, even as she refused to let go. "You disappeared into a hole in the sky and we thought... I know," Luffy said, and his own voice had gone thick now. All pretense of composure abandoned entirely, tears streaming freely down his face as he held onto his crew with both arms, like he could somehow fold the last 8 days of fear and loneliness into this single moment and make them never have happened at all. "I know. I'm sorry. I looked everywhere. I found the Sunny's wreckage and I thought..." "We got out," Frankie said, voice cracking despite his best effort to keep it steady. Arms wrapped around the whole tangled group of them now. "Barely. Structural failure during whatever that rip in the sky did to us. Super bad timing. Ship couldn't handle whatever that thing was doing to the hull integrity. We got everybody off. Built the Merry Menk 2 out of the salvage in about 2 weeks flat. Been searching ever since. Everybody," Luffy repeated, pulling back just enough to actually look at each of them, some fresh, terrified calculation running behind his eyes. "Everybody? Robin, Usopp, Brook, Jinbei. Here, present, and also present," came a dry, familiar voice from the corridor, and Robin stepped into view with her usual composed grace, though even she couldn't quite hide the genuine relief written across her face. Behind her, Usopp and Brook crowded into the doorway, Usopp already crying openly and unashamedly, Brook's skeletal face somehow managing to convey overwhelming joy despite lacking the actual musculature for expression. "Captain!" Usopp wailed, shoving past Robin to add himself to the pile. "You absolute. You scared the life out of us. Do you know how long we've been flying around this insane part of space looking for you? Do you have any idea?" "Where's Jinbei?" Luffy asked, scanning the crowded doorway. "Engine room," Robin said. "Someone had to keep the ship functional, while everyone else abandoned their posts to cry." "I am not crying," Sanji said, very obviously crying. Luffy laughed, a real laugh, whole and unguarded, the sound of 8 days of held-together fear finally breaking apart into something like relief, and pulled the whole tangled mass of his crew tighter, straw hat askew, tears still streaming, utterly, completely undone by the simple, overwhelming fact that every single person he loved most in either universe was alive, and here, and holding on to him just as tightly as he was holding on to them. "I'm never letting that stupid rift near any of you again," he said, muffled against Nami's shoulder. "Not ever. I don't care what it takes." It was Nami, eventually, practical even through tears, who pulled back enough to notice the massive Federation vessel still holding position outside their viewport, weapons trained protectively on the recovering Jem'Hadar attacker. "Luffy," she said, wiping her face. "Who exactly are your new friends? Because that ship just saved our lives, and I feel like there's a story here." Luffy grinned, finally straightening, one arm still slung around Chopper's shoulders, the other around Zoro's, refusing entirely to fully let go of anyone. "Oh, right, okay, so, this is gonna sound weird, but everything about the last 8 days has been weird," Zoro said dryly. "Try us. Okay, so basically I ended up in this whole different part of space, way bigger than anything we've explored, full of these people called the Federation, and also there's these other guys called Cardassians, and also, this part's important, there's these creepy shapeshifter guys running an army called the Dominion, who tried to test me by attacking me with soldiers. But I beat them, and now there's this whole war going on that I sort of got tangled up in without really meaning to, but it's fine because it is very clearly not fine," Nami said flatly. "Given that you just described joining a war within the first 8 days of arriving somewhere new, which is genuinely, even for you, an impressive new personal record." "I didn't join it exactly," Luffy protested. "I just decided I wasn't gonna let bad guys push people around while I figured out how to find you all. Same as always." Frankie, wiping his own eyes with the back of one massive cyborg hand, let out a booming laugh. Super typical. "All right, Captain, you're gonna have to explain the whole thing properly, but first." He glanced out the viewport at the Bellerophon, hovering protective and enormous against the starfield. "I'm guessing we should probably go say thanks to whoever's flying that thing, and figure out what exactly we just walked into." "Yeah," Luffy's grin sharpened, some of the earlier grief transmuting, right in front of them, into the familiar, restless energy of a captain, already looking ahead to the next adventure, the next fight, the next thing worth caring about. "There's a lot to explain, but first," he looked around at all of them, alive, whole, together again after 8 of the longest days of his life. "I just wanted a minute where it was just us, where nobody needed anything explained yet." Nami smiled, tears drying, and reached up to straighten his crooked hat with the easy, practiced affection of someone who'd been doing exactly that for years. "Okay, Captain. 1 minute. Then you're explaining literally everything, starting with why there's an entire war apparently waiting for us." "Deal," Luffy said, and for one more moment, surrounded by every person who mattered most in this universe, or any other, he simply let himself feel, completely and without reservation, the enormous, uncomplicated joy of being reunited at last. The war, and everything it was about to demand of all of them, could wait exactly 1 more minute. The debrief happened in the Bellerophon's largest conference room, and it took considerably longer than anyone anticipated, mostly because Luffy's crew kept interrupting each other to fill in details, argue about details, and occasionally just marvel aloud at the sheer strangeness of everything Vaughn's science team had assembled on the display screens. "So let me get this straight," Nami said, arms crossed, studying the star chart T'Preth had pulled up showing the Alpha Quadrant's major powers. "There's 4, 5 different governments out here, all with actual space empires, and you," she jabbed a finger at Luffy, "managed to get 3 of them personally invested in you within the first week. That's not even a record for you, that's just Tuesday at this point. I didn't do it on purpose. You never do it on purpose. That's what makes it impressive." Vaughn, watching from the head of the table, found himself struck by how quickly the dynamic clicked into place. Not just Luffy's obvious ease with his crew, but the way each of them slotted into a role that read, even to an outside observer, as deeply practiced. Nami ran numbers and logistics with brisk, no-nonsense efficiency. Robin absorbed unfamiliar information with the calm, patient hunger of a genuine scholar, already cross-referencing Federation history against half-remembered fragments of her own world's knowledge. Zoro said almost nothing, but his eyes tracked every mention of the Dominion, the Jem'Hadar, the war, with the focused attention of a man already planning several fights ahead. Sanji hovered near the room's replicator, apparently unable to fully relax until he'd personally verified the quality of every food source available to his captain. Frankie and Chopper peppered the ship's engineering and medical officers with an overwhelming volume of technical questions. Usopp took copious, slightly panicked notes. And Brook, when he wasn't making jokes that landed with varying success on an audience unfamiliar with his particular sense of humor, asked surprisingly sharp questions about Federation musical tradition that Vaughn suspected were less idle curiosity than the careful reconnaissance of a man gathering every possible detail about a world that might, for all any of them knew, become permanent. "The short version," Robin said finally, cutting through the crosstalk with quiet authority, "is that we've landed in the middle of an active war between at least 4 major powers, one of which, the Dominion, has already directly tested Luffy's capabilities and, by every indication, intends to continue assessing whether the rest of us represent a similar threat or a similar asset." "Is that an accurate summary, Captain Vaughn?" "That's accurate," Vaughn said, genuinely impressed by how quickly she'd distilled a week's worth of chaos into a clean assessment. "And I'd add, the system you were rescued in, Trevelyan, is currently under active Dominion blockade. 400,000 civilians are being deliberately starved toward surrender. That's the immediate situation you've walked into, whatever else you decide about the broader conflict." The room's energy shifted instantly. Zoro's eyes sharpened, Nami's arms uncrossed. Even Usopp's nervous note-taking paused. "Starved," Sanji repeated, voice gone flat and cold in a way that contrasted sharply with his usual easy charm. "Deliberately. Civilians. That's the current tactical situation, yes." Sanji stubbed out his unlit cigarette against the table's edge with more force than strictly necessary. "I have some opinions about people who use hunger as a weapon." "We noticed," Zoro said dryly. But there was no real humor in it. Just quiet, shared recognition among a crew that had, collectively, seen more than their share of exactly this kind of cruelty across their own world's various tyrannies. Luffy, who had been unusually quiet through most of the debrief, finally spoke, his voice carrying the same flat certainty Vaughn had heard from him in the observation lounge days earlier. "We're helping them." "Luffy," Nami started, "we don't even know these people. Doesn't matter." He wasn't looking at her, wasn't looking at anyone in particular. His eyes were fixed somewhere past the star chart, past the conference room walls, at something only he could currently see. 400,000 people are being starved, so some shape-shifting army can force a surrender without spending soldiers. "I already told the Dominion I wasn't going to let people like that decide what happens to anybody they think is weaker than them. I'm not changing my mind just because there's a lot more people involved this time."
"I'm not saying we shouldn't help," Nami said, more gently now.
"I'm saying we should know what we're actually walking into before we walk into it. That's just being smart, Luffy. It's not the same thing as not caring." Luffy's expression softened slightly, some of the fierce tension easing. "Yeah, okay, that's fair." He looked to Vaughn. "So what's the actual situation? Tactically, I mean. If we're gonna do this, I want to do it right." Vaughn exchanged a brief glance with Tupreth before answering. "Golzera's authorized joint access to a Cardassian resistance cell embedded on Trevelyan 3. They've been feeding intelligence on Dominion troop movements for weeks, but they don't have the firepower to break the blockade themselves. And neither, frankly, do we. Not without risking exactly the kind of full-scale engagement that could draw in additional Dominion reinforcements from elsewhere along the front. So it's not just about breaking the blockade, Robin said, following the logic immediately. It's about breaking it in a way that doesn't invite a worse response. Precisely. That, Frankie said, cracking his knuckles with an audible metallic clank. Sounds like exactly the kind of problem this crew's had plenty of practice solving. We're not exactly strangers to punching well above our weight class against people who thought they had the numbers advantage. There is also, T'Preth added, the matter of 1st Nunnex Unit, the Jem'Hadar squad that previously engaged Luffy. Intelligence suggests they've redeployed toward this system with reinforcement, likely anticipating Luffy's arrival given the pattern of anomalous vessel sightings. It is reasonable to assume the Dominion is aware of, or at minimum suspects, the reunion that has now occurred. So they know we're coming, Zoro said, something almost eager creeping into his voice. They may suspect it, yes. Good. Zoro's hand rested easily on the hilt of one sword. Saves us the trouble of surprising them. Sanji shot him a look. Not everything's about a fight, Mosshead. This one kind of is, Cook. There's 400,000 starving civilians and you're already thinking about your next duel. I'm thinking about breaking a siege, which generally involves fighting the people doing the sieging. But sure, keep pretending I'm the shallow one. Anyway, Nami cut in loudly, before the familiar bickering could fully escalate. Can we get back to actual planning? Captain Vaughn, what does the Cardassian resistance actually need from us? Specifics, not just break the blockade. Vaughn found himself, not for the first time in the last week, quietly grateful for whichever member of this chaotic, formidable crew happened to be the one holding the room's focus at any given moment. Their primary request is a disruption significant enough to force the blockade ships to concentrate defensively, creating a window for a supply convoy currently staged 2 systems away to break through and resupply the planet before the population reaches critical shortage. They estimate they have roughly 6 days before that becomes a genuine crisis, rather than a looming one. 6 days, Nami repeated, already pulling up her own calculations on a padded Robin had helped her borrow from the ship's science division, fingers moving with the brisk confidence of a navigator who'd planned 100 impossible timelines before. Okay, that's tight, but it's workable, assuming we know the actual disposition of the blockade force. I can provide current intelligence, Vaughn said, pulling up the tactical display. 6 Dominion vessels maintaining orbital position, rotating patrol patterns roughly every 4 hours, with a Jem'Hadar attack ship, likely the one your ship engaged earlier, currently undergoing repair at the edge of the system, rather than actively patrolling. That's the one that'll come back angriest, Luffy said, studying the display with unexpected focus. And 1st Nunnex reinforcements are coming too, so we're not just planning around 6 ships, we're planning around 6 ships plus whatever's inbound. Correct. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Not the reckless enthusiasm Vaughn had grown accustomed to, but something more measured, more deliberate. The voice, Vaughn realized, of a captain actually planning a battle, rather than simply charging into one. Robin, Luffy said, you're good at figuring out patterns, right? Reading how people think, not just what they do. It's something of a specialty, yes. Okay, so if the Dominion knows we're here, and they're bringing 1st Nunnex back with reinforcements, what's the actual play? Are they trying to wipe us out, or are they still testing us like before? Robin considered the question with genuine care, drawing on both the intelligence Vaughn's team had gathered and her own sharp read of the pattern so far. Based on what you've described of your first encounter, and the fact that they retreated rather than escalating to a full engagement, I'd guess they're still gathering information. A being or beings with your capabilities represents too significant and unknown for a power as calculating as you've described the Dominion to be. They'll want to understand exactly what they're facing before committing to either recruitment or elimination. So they're not going to throw everything at us right away. Unlikely in my assessment, more probable. A significant but calculated show of force, designed to provoke a fuller demonstration of your, and now our, collective capabilities, while keeping their own true reserves in reserve. Luffy nodded slowly, something calculating moving behind his eyes that Vaughn was beginning to recognize as the boy's actual command instincts finally engaging fully, no longer split between grief and hope, but focused entirely on the problem in front of him. Then that's what we give them, Luffy said. A demonstration, but not the one they're expecting. He looked around the table at his crew, each of them watching him now with the easy, practiced attention of people who'd followed this particular captain into 100 impossible fights, and won considerably more than they'd lost. Here's what I'm thinking. The plan that emerged over the next 2 hours was, by Vaughn's professional military assessment, equal parts brilliant and insane. A joint operation combining Federation tactical precision, Cardassian resistance intelligence, and a crew of pirates whose fighting philosophy seemed to consist primarily of identifying the single most audacious possible approach, and then executing it with absolute, unshakable confidence. Nami would coordinate timing with the resistance cell and the incoming supply convoy, using her navigational instincts to identify the precise window where the blockade's rotating patrol pattern created maximum vulnerability. Robin and T'Preth would work together on intelligence, cross-referencing Dominion tactical doctrine against everything the crew had learned about how the Founders actually made decisions. Frankie and the Bellerophon's engineering team would collaborate on a technical solution neither faction could have devised alone. Frankie's instinctive, unconventional engineering genius, paired with genuine Federation technology, aimed at creating exactly the kind of disruption the Resistance needed. And Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and the Bellerophon's security teams would form the tip of the spear. The direct confrontation the Dominion was clearly angling for, delivered on the crew's own terms rather than the Founders. One more thing, Luffy said, as the meeting finally began winding down, crew and Starfleet officers alike beginning to disperse toward their respective preparations. He looked to Vaughn with an expression that had, sometime over the last 2 hours, settled into something Vaughn recognized instantly from every good commanding officer he'd ever served alongside. Genuine, weighted responsibility, fully accepted. What's that? Vaughn asked. Whatever happens out there, Luffy said. However this goes, nobody who's trying to help those people on Trevian 3 gets left behind. Not your people, not the Resistance, not mine. That's non-negotiable. I don't care how the tactics shake out. Everybody comes home. Vaughn held his gaze for a long moment, recognizing in it something that transcended the strangeness of everything else about this boy. A simple, absolute moral clarity that 11 months of grinding, exhausting war had, if he was honest with himself, worn dangerously thin in his own convictions. Agreed, Vaughn said. Everybody comes home. Behind them, unnoticed in the general bustle of preparation, Zoro caught Sanji's eye across the room, and for once, the two of them shared a rare, wordless moment of complete agreement, because whatever else changed between one universe and another, whatever strange new war they'd stumbled into, some things about their captain, it seemed, would never change at all. He'd never once stopped fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He wasn't about to start now. The operation began, as most good operations did, with something that looked nothing like an operation at all. 2 days after the planning session, a small, unremarkable Cardassian freighter, one of a dozen similar vessels that had made increasingly desperate runs toward the Trevian blockade over the past weeks, most turned back, a few destroyed outright, approached the outer picket line at the exact moment the rotating patrol pattern Nami had identified created its narrowest window of coverage. What the Dominion picket ships didn't know, watching that freighter approach with the bored, practiced wariness of soldiers who'd turned back 100 similar attempts, was that it carried no cargo at all. It carried Zoro, Sanji, and 6 of the Bellerophon's most capable security officers, tucked into a modified cargo hold that Frankie had spent the better part of 2 days retrofitting with the kind of improvised, borderline insane engineering solutions that made Federation engineers wince and grudgingly admit worked anyway. Contact, came the picket ship's routine hail, precisely as expected. Unregistered freighter, you are entering restricted space. Reverse course immediately, or you will be fired upon. The freighter didn't reverse course. Instead, at a signal from Rethit, who had insisted, over Zara's initial objection, on flying the decoy vessel herself, arguing that a familiar Cardassian face at the helm would buy precious extra seconds of hesitation from any picket crew, reluctant to fire on what might be a fellow Cardassian in distress. The freighter's hull peeled open along seams Frankie had cut, and resealed with deliberate, disguised precision. Zoro was first through the gap, 3 swords already drawn, moving with the eerie, silent economy of a man who'd spent years training his body to close distance faster than an opponent's mind could process the threat. The picket ship's point defense systems tracked him on sensors. They never got the chance to fire. He was already inside their shield perimeter, blades singing through the vacuum-sealed boarding tube Frankie's modified freighter had extended in the same instant, cutting through the picket ship's outer hull with strikes that shouldn't, by any sane engineering standard, have been possible against Dominion-grade armor plating. One sword style, Zoro murmured, more habit than announcement, as he dropped into the picket ship's interior. Tatsumaki. The spinning blade technique tore through the ship's forward weapons control in a spiral of controlled devastation, disabling, not destroying, per the crew's careful agreement with Vaughn, the vessel's ability to fire without killing the skeleton crew, currently scrambling toward emergency stations in open-mouthed shock. Sanji hit the second picket ship's boarding point 30 seconds later, moving with a fluid, acrobatic grace that belied the sheer force behind every strike, his leg techniques carving through Jem'Hadar soldiers with the same controlled restraint Luffy had shown days earlier. Enough to incapacitate, never enough to kill. A code the entire crew held with the same unshakable consistency, regardless of how personal the fight had become. "Diable Jambe," he called out, flame wreathing his leg in barely visible heat shimmer, as he drove a devastating kick through a bulkhead that separated him from the second ship's engineering section. Collier shoot. The strike sent 3 Jem'Hadar crashing into their own consoles, weapons systems failing in a cascade of sparking, disabled circuitry. 2 ships down in under 90 seconds, both disabled rather than destroyed. Both crews alive but thoroughly, comprehensively unable to participate in whatever came next. "That's 2, Zoro reported over the comm, voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who genuinely enjoyed his work. Moving to the 3rd. Aboard the Bellerophon, holding position at the edge of sensor range with the rest of the Joint Task Force, 3 Cardassian resistance vessels, coordinating in real time now that the blockade's attention was fracturing exactly as planned. Vaughn watched the tactical display with the particular tension of a commander whose plan was, against every reasonable expectation, actually working. 2 picket ships disabled, minimal casualties reported on either side. T'Preth confirmed. The remaining 4 vessels are beginning to redistribute toward the disabled ships' positions. Exactly as Robin predicted, Dominion doctrine prioritizes rapid reinforcement of compromised assets, which means the blockade's coverage over the planet's southern approach is about to open up, Vaughn said, already relaying the update. "Nami, you're clear to guide the convoy in." "Copy that, Captain." Nami's voice crackled back, steady and focused, coordinating from the small straw hat vessel positioned at the edge of the operation alongside the resistance fleet. Convoy's moving now. If your people can hold that gap open for 11 more minutes, we thread it clean. 11 minutes, Vaughn repeated. To Preth. Time until the reinforcing Dominion vessels, including 1st Ninix unit, if intelligence holds, reach the system. Current long-range tracking suggests arrival within 8 to 10 minutes, Captain. It will be close. Vaughn's jaw tightened. Close was, in his considerable military experience, rarely a comfortable place to operate from. But close, in this particular case, was also exactly the margin the entire plan had been built around. Because closing that margin, buying the extra minutes the convoy needed, was precisely the role Luffy had insisted on taking for himself. Luffy, Vaughn said, opening a direct channel to the shuttle currently holding position near the system's edge. Reinforcements incoming, 8 to 10 minutes out. You're up. Copy that, Captain, came Luffy's voice. And even through the comm static, Vaughn could hear the grin in it. The particular, electric anticipation of a fighter about to do exactly what he was built for. Time to go say hi to some old friends. 1st Ninix reinforced squadron dropped out of transit at the edge of the Trevian system with the disciplined, overwhelming precision of Dominion military doctrine. 6 additional Jem'Hadar attack vessels, a command ship, and 1st Ninix himself aboard the lead vessel, his Ketracel white levels carefully calibrated, his orders from Wayun 7 explicit and precise. Observe, engage if necessary, but above all, gather usable intelligence on the full extent of what this cohort represents. What he found waiting for him, hovering directly in his squadron's projected flight path with the casual, unbothered posture of a man waiting for a bus rather than an armada, was Luffy, alone, no ship, no visible support, simply drifting in the vacuum of space, with his arms crossed, and his straw hat somehow, impossibly, still perfectly in place. You, Ninix said over open comm, genuine surprise cutting through his usual clipped discipline. You survive unaided in vacuum. Yeah, we covered this already, Luffy called back, cheerful and utterly unbothered by the 6 attack ships now decelerating around him. You gonna introduce me to your friends this time, or we skipping straight to the fighting part again? You are alone. Ninix sensors confirmed it, and something in his voice shifted. Not quite confusion, but the particular unease of a soldier recalculating an equation that had, once again, refused to behave as expected. This is either extraordinary confidence or a fundamental misunderstanding of the force you now face. Neither, really. Luffy's grin sharpened, and for the first time since arriving in this quadrant, he let something shift beneath his skin. Not the full weight of everything he carried, not yet, but enough. Armament Haki flooded outward in a visible wave, a shimmer of black glass intent rolling across his exposed skin, and beneath it, deeper, older, something vast and crushing, and entirely without mercy began to stir. I'm just here to buy time, and honestly, I've got plenty to spare. Conqueror's Haki, when it finally released, not aimed at anyone specific, simply allowed to exist, unfiltered, radiating outward in a silent, world-ending pulse of pure will, did something none of Ninix's tactical training had prepared him for. 3 of his 6 pilots simply lost consciousness at their stations, the crushing weight of a captain's unbreakable resolve overwhelming minds that had never once, in their entire engineered existence, encountered anything capable of imposing will upon them so absolutely. Ninix himself staggered, gripping his command console hard enough to crack the housing, sheer Jem'Hadar discipline the only thing keeping him upright against a pressure that felt, disorientingly, like the universe itself had decided to lean against his skull. What, he managed, voice rough, was that? That's the part I don't usually show people right away, Luffy said, and something in his tone had gone genuinely quietly dangerous now, all trace of playfulness folded away beneath absolute focused intent. "But you brought a lot of friends this time, and I've got exactly 10 minutes to make sure none of you get anywhere near a supply convoy full of food for people you've been trying to starve." So, he rolled his shoulders, Gear Second's telltale steam already beginning to curl off heated skin. "Let's not waste either of our time pretending this ends any other way." 3 Jem'Hadar vessels, their pilots unconscious, drifted uselessly out of formation. The remaining 3, along with Ninek's command ship, opened fire in unison. Full spread, no restraint. The exact opposite of a probing test. Luffy met it head-on. What followed was, by any reasonable military standard, an engagement that shouldn't have been survivable for a single unarmored combatant against 4 warships firing at full capacity. But Luffy moved through the barrage with Gear Second's speed compounding into something closer to Gear Third's raw destructive force where it mattered, weaving between concentrated disruptor fire with the eerie, practiced precision of observation haki reading each shot's trajectory a full half-second before it fired. Armament Haki hardening every surface he couldn't avoid into something that could shrug off even direct hits. Gomu Gomu no, his arm inflated, bones and muscle bulking to impossible proportions as Gear Third's massive fist connected with the nearest attack ship's hull. Gigant pistol. The strike didn't merely disable the vessel. It folded the ship's forward hull inward like crumpled paper, sending it spinning off its intercept course entirely. Crew alive but the vessel thoroughly, comprehensively removed from the fight. Ninek watched it happen with the particular dawning horror of a soldier realizing, in real time, that everything his previous engagement had taught him about this opponent's ceiling had been wrong. Not because the earlier data was flawed, but because the boy had, quite deliberately, been showing him only a fraction of what he actually carried. "Fall back," Ninek ordered, voice tight. "Regroup at." "Nah," Luffy said, genuinely appearing, faster than any sensor sweep could properly track, directly in front of Ninek's own command ship's forward viewport, Gear Second steam still curling off him, expression sharp and focused. "You don't get to fall back yet. Not till my friends are done with what they're doing." He drove one final strike, Haki hardened, precisely calibrated, devastating but survivable, directly into the command ship's primary systems conduit, the impact staggering the entire vessel, disabling weapons and propulsion alike without breaching hull integrity or endangering the crew inside. Silence fell across the drifting, disabled squadron. Luffy hovered before Ninek's crippled ship, breathing hard now, the visible cost of the last several minutes' effort finally showing in the slight tremor of overworked muscle, but grin still firmly, defiantly in place. "That," Ninek's voice crackled over the still-functioning emergency comm, rough with something that had shifted, somewhere in the last several minutes, from contempt into genuine grudging respect. "Was not a demonstration of your full capability, was it?" "Nope," Luffy said cheerfully. "But you're gonna go tell your bosses it was anyway, right? Save us both some time?" A long pause. Then, quietly, "Yes, I believe I will." Below, on the outer edge of the system, the supply convoy threaded cleanly through the gap Luffy's diversion had bought them. Resistance escort vessels flanking the precious cargo of food and medical supplies as it broke through toward Trevian 3's surface, exactly on the timeline Nami's careful calculations had promised. "Convoys through," Nami's voice rang out over the joint tactical channel, relief and triumph both audible even through comm static. "Repeat, convoy has successfully broken the blockade. Trevian 3, you're getting your supplies." Aboard the Bellerophon, Vaughn allowed himself, for the first time in what felt like the longest 11 months of his career, something close to genuine, uncomplicated relief. "All units," he said, "stand down from active engagement. Confirm status. The reports came in one by one. Zoro and Sanji's boarding teams extracting cleanly from the disabled picket ships, minimal injuries on any side. The resistance fleet regrouping to escort the convoy the rest of the way to the surface. And, finally, Luffy's own voice, tired but bright, crackling over the comm as he made his way back toward the Bellerophon, under his own considerable power. "Hey, Captain," Luffy said. "Mission accomplished, right? Tell me it worked. Tell me those people are getting their food." "It worked," Vaughn confirmed. "Trevian 3's blockade has a gap in it wide enough to matter, and the convoy's already making planetfall. You did it, Luffy. We did it." Luffy corrected, warmth threading through the exhaustion in his voice. "Whole crew, whole fleet. That's kind of the point." Vaughn found himself watching the tactical display resolve into a picture of cautious, hard-won success, quietly, genuinely smiling. Because for the first time since this impossible boy had fallen into his life 8, now closer to 11, days ago, the war didn't feel quite so unwinnable. It felt, for the first time in longer than Vaughn cared to admit, like something worth still fighting for. Far across the sector, in the golden chamber where patience had, for the first time in a long while, been genuinely tested, Weiyun 7 delivered his report to a founder whose displeasure was, for once, entirely unconcealed. "The subject deliberately withheld his full capability during our previous engagement, Founder," Weiyun said carefully. "First Nenek's report suggests we have significantly underestimated not merely his power, but his tactical restraint, his willingness to show us exactly as much force as necessary to achieve his objective, and not one measure more." "And his companions?" the founder asked, voice cold. "Equally capable, by all indications, in their own specialized registers. The swordsman alone disabled a fully crewed picket vessel in under a minute. This is no longer a single unpredictable variable, Founder." Weiyun's smile had, for the first time since this entire affair began, entirely vanished. "This is a fully operational, extraordinarily coordinated fighting unit, now actively allied with both the Federation and the Cardassian Union, and demonstrably willing to intervene directly against Dominion operations." The golden mist churned, slow and deliberate, ancient patience finally giving way to something considerably sharper. "Then it is time," the founder said, "that the Dominion stop testing, Weiyun, and started planning in earnest. Whatever this crew represents, it has just cost us the Trevian line. I will not permit it to cost us the war." Victory, Vaughn had learned over a long career, rarely stayed uncomplicated for long. The Trevian success bought them exactly 9 days of relative quiet before the shape of what came next began revealing itself. And when it did, it arrived not as an attack, but as something considerably harder to plan against: silence. "Nothing," T'Preth reported, for the 3rd consecutive day, standing before the Bellerophon's bridge crew with an expression that carried, even by Vulcan standards, an unusual weight of concern. No Dominion vessel movement along the entire Western Front, no comm traffic, no supply convoys, no patrol rotations, nothing matching any pattern in our historical database. It is as though the Dominion has simply ceased all military activity in this sector. "That's not good," Nami said immediately, looking up from the tactical display she'd taken to studying almost obsessively since Trevian, her navigator's instincts for reading patterns clearly unsettled by the absence of one. "Enemies don't just go quiet because they're scared. They go quiet because they're planning something bigger than you can see yet." "My assessment precisely," T'Preth agreed. "Starfleet intelligence shares the concern. Admiral Tanaka has requested the Bellerophon remain on station pending further developments, rather than pursuing any additional joint operations with Union forces." Luffy, sprawled across one of the bridge's auxiliary consoles in a posture that had earned him no fewer than 4 gentle corrections from Starfleet regulations he mostly ignored, frowned at the star chart with unusual focus. So they're regrouping, figuring out what to do about us. That would be the logical interpretation, yes. Good, Zorro said, from where he'd taken up his now customary post near the bridge's aft bulkhead, eyes closed, apparently meditating, though everyone aboard had learned by now that he absorbed every word of every briefing, regardless of how asleep he looked. Means we get time to figure out what we're doing about them too. It was Robin, 3 days later, poring over declassified Federation intelligence reports Vaughn had authorized her access to as part of the crew's expanding role in the joint operation, who found the thread that finally broke the silence's meaning open. "Captain," she said, gathering the bridge crew and Luffy's assembled officers into the conference room with a quiet urgency that immediately commanded everyone's attention. "I believe I understand what the Dominion has been doing during this quiet period. It's not merely regrouping, it's consolidating." She pulled up a star chart considerably larger than anything they'd worked with before. Not just the Trevayan sector, but a broad swath of contested territory stretching across nearly a dozen systems. Federation long-range sensor platforms have logged unusual troop and vessel movement patterns across this entire region over the past 9 days. Not toward us specifically, but toward a central staging point here. She indicated a system marked with minimal Federation data, mostly gaps and question marks. Designated in older Cardassian survey records as the Kelvara system. Sparsely charted, strategically insignificant by any conventional metric. No valuable resources, no populated worlds. Nothing that would normally justify this scale of consolidation. "So why there?" Vaughn asked. "Because," Robin said, and something in her careful, measured voice carried genuine unease now, "Kelvara sits at the geometric center of every major flashpoint currently active across this front, equidistant from Trevayan, from the Cardassian Federation demilitarized zone, from at least 3 other contested systems currently seeing elevated Dominion activity. If the Dominion intends a single, decisive strike designed to reassert control across this entire region in one coordinated action, Kelvara is exactly where I would choose to stage it from." Silence fell across the conference room as the implication settled. "They're not planning another probe," Luffy said slowly, his earlier restless energy replaced by something colder, more focused. "They're planning something that hits everywhere at once." "That is my assessment, yes," Robin confirmed. "And Captain Vaughn, there's a further concern. The scale of consolidation Federation sensors have logged is considerably larger than anything documented in this theater since the war's opening months. Whatever the Dominion intends, it does not read as a localized response to our victory at Trevayan. It reads as a strategic recalibration of their entire approach to this front. Because of us," Sanji said quietly, understanding dawning. "They decided we're too dangerous to keep testing piecemeal, so they're going for something that ends the question all at once. That would be consistent with the pattern, yes." Vaughn felt the familiar weight of command settle heavier across his shoulders, the particular burden of a situation that had, in the space of a single briefing, transformed from a regional skirmish into something approaching a full theater-level crisis. "To Preth, I want everything Starfleet intelligence has on Kelvara, historical and current." "Nami, Robin, I'd like your assessment integrated into our own intelligence picture. If the Dominion's staging a coordinated offensive, we need to understand its scope before Starfleet Command decides how to respond. Because I guarantee you Central Command is having this same conversation right now, and neither government can afford to respond to this piecemeal the way we've handled everything up to this point." "What about us?" Luffy asked. "My crew, I mean. We're not exactly attached to either government's chain of command." Vaughn considered the question carefully, aware of exactly how much weight it carried. "That's your decision to make, Luffy." Nobody's ordering you into a war this size. What I can tell you is that if the Dominion is genuinely planning a coordinated strike across this scale of territory, a lot more than 400,000 civilians are going to be caught in the middle of it this time. Luffy's jaw tightened, and around the table his crew exchanged the particular, wordless glances of people who already knew, collectively, exactly where this conversation was headed, long before their captain said it aloud. "Then I guess," Luffy said finally, "we're staying in this fight, all the way through this time, not just for Trevian, for whatever comes next too." The next several days blurred into a grinding cycle of intelligence gathering, tense diplomatic exchanges between Starfleet Command and Cardassian Central Command over how to respond to an enemy consolidation neither side fully understood yet, and, for the crew of the Straw Hat Pirates, newly and permanently woven into a war that had, weeks ago, belonged to an entirely different universe. The strange, disorienting work of settling into something like a genuine role within it. Zoro spent his idle hours sparring against increasingly capable Starfleet security officers, teaching swordsmanship techniques that had no Federation equivalent, and learning, in exchange, enough about phaser combat and Cardassian close-quarters doctrine to genuinely respect opponents he'd have dismissed out of hand only weeks earlier. Sanji, to nobody's great surprise, ended up spending considerable time in the Bellerophon's galley, trading recipes with the ship's culinary staff, and somehow managing, through sheer stubborn talent, to make the ship's replicated ingredients taste like something worth genuinely savoring, rather than merely functional. Frankie and Chief Engineer Kell had become something close to inseparable, their combined engineering instincts producing modifications to the crew's small vessel that made even T'Preth's carefully controlled Vulcan composure crack, occasionally, into something like genuine astonishment. And Luffy spent his time doing what he always did best, in any universe, talking to Vaughn about command and responsibility and the particular weight of decisions that cost lives no matter which way they broke. To Corrigan, about nothing in particular, the easy friendship between them settling into something genuinely comfortable, despite the widening gulf between a Starfleet ensign's careful, regulation-bound world and a pirate captain's freewheeling one. To Zara, on one memorable occasion, about the nature of duty and sacrifice, a conversation that left the normally unflappable ghoul quietly, visibly moved in a way she clearly hadn't expected and wasn't entirely comfortable admitting to. It was during one such conversation, 9 days after Robin's briefing, that the quiet finally broke. "Captain Vaughn," T'Preth's voice cut through the ready room, where Vaughn and Luffy had been discussing, with considerably more depth than either had expected going in, the philosophical differences between Starfleet's principle of non-interference and Luffy's own instinctive, unshakable code of direct intervention. Long-range sensors are picking up massive subspace displacement originating from the Kelvara system. Multiple simultaneous departures, consistent with a coordinated fleet deployment. Vaughn was on his feet immediately. "Report to the bridge. All hands." He looked to Luffy, who had already risen, the easy warmth of moments earlier replaced instantly by the same sharp, focused readiness Vaughn had come to recognize as the boy's true combat posture. "This is it, isn't it?" "Yeah," Luffy said quietly, straightening his hat with a gesture that had, over these past weeks, become as much a ritual of preparation as any Starfleet officer donning a uniform. "This is it." On the bridge, the tactical display painted a picture grim enough that even T'Preth's careful Vulcan composure showed visible strain as she read out the developing intelligence. "Multiple Dominion battle groups, Captain. Current estimates suggest 6 to 8 separate task forces, deploying simultaneously toward 6 to 8 distinct targets across the theater. Trevian 3 is among them. They're going back for the planet we saved," Sanji said, arriving on the bridge at a run, expression thunderous. Not only Trevian, Tepreth continued. Preliminary analysis suggests this is a coordinated offensive intended to strike every significant point of Federation-Cardassian cooperation established over the past weeks simultaneously. Designed, I believe, specifically to prevent any of us from concentrating force at a single point, the way we did at Trevian initially. They learned, Robin said quietly, arriving alongside Sanji, her sharp analytical mind already turning the tactical picture over, exactly as the story's pattern predicted they would. They can't outfight this crew in a single, contained engagement, so they've restructured their entire strategy to make a single engagement impossible. Vaughn felt the full weight of the moment settle across his shoulders. 11 months of grinding war suddenly compressed into a single, decisive crisis that would define not just the fate of one contested planet, but the entire shape of the theater going forward. Options, he said, voice tight. We cannot be everywhere, Captain, Tepreth said. Not the Bellerophon alone, not the Joint Task Force, not even accounting for Luffy's crew's demonstrated capabilities. 8 simultaneous engagements exceed any reasonable concentration of force available to us. Then we don't try to be everywhere, Luffy said, and every head on the bridge turned toward him. There was something in his voice now that Vaughn hadn't heard before. Not the reckless confidence of their first meeting, not even the focused determination of Trevian, but something older, harder earned. The voice of a man who had led people through impossible odds more times than anyone else in that room combined, and had, somewhere in the process, learned exactly how those fights were actually won. We pick the ones that matter most, Luffy continued, and we make sure every single person fighting alongside us knows exactly what they're walking into, and exactly why it's worth it. And for the rest, he looked to Vaughn, something fierce and absolute settling behind his eyes. We trust the people we've spent the last few weeks building this alliance with. Zera's resistance networks, every Starfleet crew in this sector, everybody who's already proven they're willing to fight for something bigger than just themselves. That's not a plan, Vaughn said, but there was no real objection in it. More genuine consideration than dismissal. That's a philosophy. Yeah, Luffy agreed, grin flickering back for just a moment, sharp and fierce and entirely, unshakably certain. But it's the one that's gotten me and my crew through worse odds than this every single time. Trust the people fighting beside you. Hit hardest where it matters most. And never, ever let the enemy convince you that spreading thin means giving up. Vaughn held his gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly, felt something in his own chest, worn thin by 11 months of a war that had, for so long, felt like nothing but grinding, unglamorous attrition, begin to steady, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, around something that felt, unmistakably, like genuine hope. All right, he said, turning back to his crew, voice carrying clear and steady across the bridge. Let's build that plan properly. Tepreth, get me Starfleet Command and Central Command on a joint channel. If the Dominion's committing to an 8-front offensive, they need to know right now, because this isn't a decision any single ship or single government gets to make alone anymore. The bridge exploded into focused, purposeful motion, officers moving to stations with the crisp, practiced efficiency of a crew that had, over these past weeks, learned to trust not just their own captain, but the strange, impossible, wholly unexpected ally's fate, or whatever cosmic accident had torn a boy in a straw hat out of one universe and dropped him into another, had brought crashing into their war. Above them all, on the main view screen, the tactical display continued updating in real time. 8 separate crimson markers spreading like a slow, deliberate stain across a theater that had, until 9 days ago, believed itself to finally be catching its breath. The true climax of this war, the one that would decide not just the fate of a single planet or a single contested sector, but the entire shape of the conflict going forward had finally, unmistakably, begun. War rooms, Vaughn had learned long ago, ran on a particular kind of controlled chaos. 100 voices competing for attention, 1,000 variables shifting by the minute, and at the center of it, someone who had to somehow hold the whole churning mess steady enough to make decisions that mattered. What he hadn't expected, walking into the Bellerophon's conference room 6 hours after the Dominion's fleet deployment first registered on long-range sensors, was that the person doing the holding wouldn't be him, or Admiral Tanaka patched in from Starfleet Command, or even Gul Zera glowering from the Cardassian side of the Joint Channel. It would be a 19-year-old pirate captain, standing at the head of the table with a star chart projected behind him, speaking with an authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the simple, absolute fact that everyone in the room, admirals, gulls, and crewmates alike, had, somewhere in the last several weeks, started trusting his instincts more than their own doctrine. 8 targets, Luffy said, tapping the crimson markers one by one. Trevian 3, obviously. They want that back worse than anything, both 'cause it's strategically useful and 'cause we humiliated them there. Then 7 more, spread across a front wide enough that nobody can reinforce more than 2 or 3 without leaving the rest completely open. Correct, T'Preth confirmed. Starfleet intelligence estimates total committed Dominion forces at nearly 60 vessels, divided unevenly based on the perceived value of each target. Trevian 3 alone is projected to face the largest single concentration, approximately 14 ships, including what our analysts believe to be at least 2 Jem'Hadar battle cruisers, a class we have not previously encountered active in this theater. Admiral Tanaka's image, patched in from Starfleet Command with the tight, controlled urgency of someone who'd clearly been awake far too long, leaned forward. 60 vessels committed simultaneously represents nearly a third of documented Dominion strength along this entire front. If this offensive succeeds, we're not just losing territory, we're looking at a strategic collapse that could unravel 18 months of hard-won ground in a single day. Central Command shares that assessment, Zera added, her own image sharp and grim on the adjacent screen, which is precisely why the Union is prepared to commit every available vessel to this response, joint operation or otherwise. We cannot afford half measures, Captain Vaughn. Not against this. Vaughn nodded, but his eyes stayed on the tactical display, on the 8 scattered markers representing 8 separate battles about to unfold simultaneously, across a region of space too vast for any conventional force to properly defend. The math doesn't work, though. Even combining every Federation and Cardassian vessel currently available in this sector, we can't match 60 ships spread across 8 fronts without leaving critical gaps somewhere. Then we don't try to match them ship for ship, Luffy said. We use what actually wins fights, knowing exactly where the fight matters most, and making sure the people we send there can win decisively enough that it changes the whole picture. Meaning? Tanaka asked. Robin stepped forward, having spent the last several hours cross-referencing Dominion tactical doctrine with everything the crew had learned about how founders actually made strategic decisions. Meaning, Admiral, that this offensive, for all its scale, has a specific vulnerability built into its design. The Dominion is spreading itself thin, specifically to prevent concentration of Federation Cardassian Straw Hat forces at any single point. But that same logic cuts both ways. If we can identify which of these 8 targets the Dominion considers most critical to the offensive's overall success, and commit an overwhelming decisive response there, not merely adequate, but genuinely overwhelming, we don't just win that engagement, we fracture their confidence in the entire strategy. And you believe that target is Trevian, Zera said. I believe it's the target they've committed the most force to, which suggests it's the target they consider most symbolically and strategically vital. Robin confirmed. Recapturing it wouldn't just be a tactical victory for them. It would be a statement, proof that our victory there was an anomaly, rather than the beginning of a genuine shift in this war's momentum. So we concentrate there, Vaughn said slowly, and accept greater risk at the other 7 targets. We concentrate there, Luffy said, but we don't abandon the other 7. We just make sure everybody fighting those 7 fights knows they're not expected to win outright. They're expected to hold, to slow things down, to buy time, while the fight that actually decides this happens at Trevian. He looked around the room, meeting each set of eyes in turn. Vaughn's, Zayra's, Tanaka's image on the screen. That's not me being reckless. That's just how you fight a battle you can't win everywhere at once. You pick the ground that matters most, and you make damn sure you own it completely. The room fell quiet for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling across everyone present, because what Luffy was describing wasn't merely a military strategy. It was a wager, staking the outcome of an entire multi-front war on the belief that 7 scattered, undermanned defensive actions could hold just long enough for one decisive victory to change the shape of everything. It was Tanaka, finally, who broke the silence. Captain Vaughn, your assessment? Vaughn considered the question with the full weight of 11 months of grinding, uncertain war behind it, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that his answer came easily. I think it's the only plan that actually accounts for what we're facing, rather than pretending we have resources we don't. I recommend we commit to it. Central Command concurs, Zayra said, with the particular finality of a decision that had already, quietly, been made the moment Luffy started speaking. Tanaka nodded slowly. Then let's build the actual deployment. Trevian gets our heaviest concentration, the Bellerophon, the Straw Hat vessel, and I'm authorizing 3 additional Starfleet vessels currently on standby along the DMZ to redeploy immediately. The remaining 7 targets get coordinated Federation Cardassian defensive task forces, sized to hold rather than to win outright. Understood? Understood, Vaughn confirmed. Then God help all of us, Tanaka said quietly, because we're about to find out if this alliance actually works under real pressure, not just against isolated skirmishes. Her image flickered, already moving to the next urgent call in what would clearly be a very long several hours. Good luck, Captain. All of you. The channel closed, and the conference room's energy shifted immediately into focused, purposeful motion. Officers dispersing to their stations, Zayra's image dissolving as she turned to her own fleet's preparations. The crew of the Straw Hat pirates exchanging the particular, wordless glances of people who had, collectively, weathered 100 impossible odds together and found, every time, some way through. All right, Luffy said, once the room had cleared to just his own crew and Vaughn. Trevian's our fight. That mean everybody's in? When have we ever not been? Zoro said, already checking the edge of his blades with the quiet, focused ritual of a man preparing for the fight of his life. Just checking, Luffy said, grinning, though something serious moved beneath it. This one's bigger than anything we've done since we got here. I want everybody going in with their eyes open, not just following me, 'cause that's what we always do. Nami crossed her arms, expression softening from its usual brisk practicality into something warmer, steadier. Luffy, we didn't follow you across 2 seas and half a dozen governments just to get cold feet. The one time it actually matters this much. We're in. All of us, same as always. Around the table, the rest of the crew nodded. Sanji's quiet, fierce determination, Frankie's booming, unshakable confidence, Chopper's small frame squaring with more resolve than his size suggested he could carry, Usopp's nervous energy settling, as it always did in the moments that truly counted, into genuine courage, Robin's calm, analytical certainty, Brooke's skeletal grin somehow conveying more warmth than words could manage. Then let's go finish what we started at Trevain, Luffy said, straightening his hat with the same familiar gesture that had, over these past weeks, become as much a declaration of intent as any battle cry. Properly this time, all the way through. The Bellerophon and its assembled task force dropped out of warp at the edge of the Trevain system 19 hours later, met immediately by a Dominion force considerably larger and more disciplined than anything the joint operation had faced during the initial blockade breaking. 14 vessels arranged in a defensive formation, clearly designed by commanders who had studied their previous defeat with genuine, careful attention. They learned, T'Preth confirmed, scanning the enemy disposition with visible tension. Formation patterns suggest countermeasures specifically designed to prevent the kind of decisive strike Luffy used against 1st Ninek Squadron previously. They're maintaining greater dispersal, mutual covering fire, and, she paused, frowning at a new sensor reading. Captain, I'm detecting an energy signature I don't recognize, originating from the lead Jem'Hadar battlecruiser. It doesn't match any weapons profile in our database. New tech? Vaughn asked. Possibly. Or possibly a countermeasure specifically calibrated to Luffy's demonstrated abilities. I would advise extreme caution. On the bridge, Luffy studied the enemy formation with a focus that had, over these past weeks, replaced most of his earlier reckless enthusiasm with something considerably more calculating. They're not gonna make the same mistakes twice. Good. Means this'll actually be interesting. Luffy, Vaughn said, whatever that new energy signature is, I need you and your crew to exercise real caution going in. We don't yet understand what we're facing. We never really do, Captain, Luffy said, grin sharp and ready. That's kind of the whole point of fighting people worth fighting. He looked to his crew, gathered now on the bridge in the moments before deployment, each of them carrying the particular, focused stillness of warriors about to commit fully to a battle they understood might be the hardest they'd faced in this entire quadrant. All right, same plan as before, but bigger. Zoro, Sanji, you're taking the flanking ships, same as Trevain's first round, but watch yourselves. They've clearly adapted their formations to counter exactly that approach. Frankie, Chopper, support role, keep our ship mobile, and keep everybody patched up. Nami, Usopp, Robin, Brook, coordinate with the Bellerophon's tactical team, same as before. And you? Nami asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. I'm taking the lead ship, Luffy said. Whatever that new weapon is, I want it tested against me first, not any of you. Luffy, I mean it, Nami. His voice carried none of its usual playfulness now, just flat, absolute certainty. If they built something specifically to counter what I can do, I need to know what it is before anybody else gets caught by surprise. That's not me being reckless. That's me doing my job as captain. Nami held his gaze for a long moment, old worry and old trust warring visibly behind her eyes, before she finally nodded. The particular, hard-won acceptance of someone who had, across years of impossible fights, learned exactly when arguing with her captain's decisions was pointless, and when it genuinely mattered, and recognized, in this moment, that it was the former. Fine, she said, but you come back from this one in one piece, Captain. That's non-negotiable. Always do, Luffy said, grin returning, warm and certain. Let's go save this planet, again. The battle that followed unfolded across nearly 2 hours of grinding, brutal engagement, considerably longer and more costly than the initial blockade breaking, as 14 Dominion vessels, forewarned and adapted, fought with a discipline and coordination that tested every ounce of the Joint Task Force's capability. Zoro and Sanji cut through the flanking formation with the same devastating efficiency as before, but this time faced genuine resistance. Jem'Hadar boarding parties waiting for them with countermeasures specifically calibrated to close-quarters combat, forcing both fighters into engagements considerably more taxing than their earlier, cleaner victories. "They're using dampening fields," Sanji reported over the comm, breathing hard between strikes. Diable Jambe's flame guttering weaker than usual against unfamiliar countermeasures. "Something's interfering with..." "Zoro, watch your left. They're trying to..." "I see it." Zoro's blade caught an incoming strike at an angle that should have been impossible to anticipate. Years of honed instinct compensating for whatever subtle interference the Dominion's new technology was attempting to impose. "They've gotten smarter. Doesn't mean they've gotten strong enough to actually stop us." Aboard the Bellerophon, Vaughn coordinated the wider engagement with the practiced, exhausted precision of a captain who had, across 11 months of war, learned to hold 100 variables steady under fire. But even his considerable experience found itself tested by the sheer scale and coordination of the Dominion's adapted assault. "Shields at 63%, came the report from Tactical. "Enemy formations maintaining mutual covering fire more effectively than any previous engagement we've logged. Captain, at current attrition rates, we're looking at a battle of attrition we may not win outright." "Understood. Redirect power from non-essential systems to shields and weapons." To Preth, "Status on Luffy's engagement with the lead vessel." "Ongoing, Captain. The unknown weapon system has activated." "I'm detecting." To Preth's composure cracked, just slightly, at whatever her sensors were now reading. "Captain, the energy signature is directly targeting Luffy specifically. It appears to be some form of directed subspace disruption field, calibrated in a manner I've never encountered." On the main view screen, the battle's largest and most dangerous confrontation played out in stark, terrible clarity. Luffy, alone, against the Dominion's lead battlecruiser, facing a weapon system built, specifically and deliberately, to counter everything that had made him unbeatable so far. The field, when it fully engaged, didn't strike him like a weapon. It settled over him like a heavy, invisible weight. And for the first time since arriving in this quadrant, Luffy felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. His own strength, genuinely, meaningfully, beginning to falter. "Oh," he said, quietly, feeling Gear Second's usual surge of speed and power arrive muted, dampened, fighting against resistance that had no business existing in the physics of his own body. "That's new." The Dominion had, in the 9 days of silence that preceded this offensive, found something they'd never managed before. They'd found a way to make him weaker. The weight settled deeper with every passing second, and Luffy, who had spent years learning exactly how his own body worked, exactly what its limits were and weren't, recognized almost immediately that this wasn't ordinary exhaustion, and it wasn't ordinary damage. Something about the field pressing down on him felt less like an attack and more like an argument, a targeted, mechanical insistence that his body operate according to rules it had never once, in his entire life, been forced to obey. "Talk to me, Preth," Vaughn said, watching the tactical display with mounting alarm, as Luffy's movement, still fast, still dangerous, but visibly, measurably slower than moments earlier, began losing ground against the lead battlecruiser's return fire. "What is that field actually doing to him?" "Working theory, Captain." Preth's fingers flew across her console, cross-referencing incoming sensor data against every scrap of biological information Dr. Reyes had compiled over the past weeks. "The field appears to be generating a highly specific subspace resonance, tuned to interfere with whatever biological or energetic process governs his gears. It is not damaging him directly. It is suppressing the mechanism that allows his abilities to function at full capacity. Can he push through it? Unknown. This technology does not correspond to anything in Federation or Cardassian records. I suspect the Dominion developed it specifically and rapidly in direct response to their previous engagements with him, a targeted countermeasure built from careful observation of exactly how his power operates. Aboard the small vessel positioned nearby, Nami watched the same feed with her stomach twisting into a knot of old, familiar fear, the particular terror of watching her captain, for the first time in longer than she wanted to remember, genuinely struggling against an opponent. "Frankie," she said, voice tight, "is there anything we can do? Jam that field? Disrupt it somehow?" "Working on it, Nami sis. But I don't have enough data on the signal's actual structure to build a counter fast enough." Frankie's voice carried real strain now, hands flying across a jury-rigged console he'd assembled from equal parts Cardassian, Federation, and his own idiosyncratic engineering philosophy. "If I had another few minutes, maybe. But Luffy doesn't have a few minutes." He didn't. On the view screen, the lead battle cruiser's commander, a Vorta officer whose calm, satisfied expression suggested he understood precisely how effective his ship's new weapon was proving, pressed the advantage, coordinating a second wave of Jem'Hadar fighters to close in on a target that, for the first time since this entire conflict began, appeared genuinely vulnerable. Luffy felt the dampening field's weight pressing harder against every fiber of his strength, felt Gear Second's usual surge arriving muted, half-formed, like trying to run at full speed through water. Disruptor fire clipped his shoulder, not deflected cleanly this time, not absorbed without cost, but genuinely, meaningfully connecting, driving a spike of real pain through muscle that had, for weeks, felt functionally invincible. He staggered. For the first time since arriving in this quadrant, Luffy genuinely staggered. "Okay," he thought, gritting his teeth against the pain, against the strange, smothering pressure trying to argue his own body out of what it knew how to do. "Okay, that's actually a problem," he thought, in the space of that single, suspended moment, of every fight across two seas that had ever pushed him this close to his actual limits. Kaido's crushing, merciless power. Katakuri's terrifying, precise mastery of observation haki. The long, grinding weeks of training that had taught him, again and again, that his limits weren't fixed points but boundaries he could choose, through sheer will, to push past. He thought of Nami's fear-tight voice on the calm moments earlier, of Zoro and Sanji fighting somewhere behind him against an enemy that had, finally, learned how to genuinely hurt them. He thought of 400,000 people on the surface below, who had already once been saved by this crew, and would, if this battle went badly, pay the price for it a second time. He thought, mostly, about how much this particular kind of fight, being told, mechanically, artificially, that his strength had a ceiling someone else got to set, genuinely, deeply pissed him off. Something old and vast stirred beneath his skin. The awakening had come to him slowly, over years, in fits and starts that even Luffy himself had never fully understood. A power that lived somewhere beneath conscious thought, tied not to training or technique in the way his other abilities were, but to something closer to identity itself. It was the power of a being who had, somewhere in the depths of his own nature, stopped being merely a man who ate rubber, and become something the old stories called Nika, the sun god, the bringer of liberation, the physical embodiment of freedom itself made real. He hadn't used it yet in this quadrant. Some instinct, some careful, deliberate restraint he rarely applied to anything else, had held it in reserve. A power so far beyond anything else he carried, that unleashing it changed not just the fight, but the fundamental rules the fight operated under. The dampening field, built with careful, methodical precision to suppress the biological and energetic processes governing his gears, had never once accounted for a power that didn't operate on biology or energy signatures at all. Nika's gift wasn't a mechanism to be measured and countered. It was joy, made manifest. It was the simple, absolute, unbreakable refusal to accept that anyone, Yonko, Emperor, Founder, or otherwise, got to decide the shape of another person's freedom. The transformation, when it came, didn't fight the dampening field. It simply, entirely, stopped acknowledging that the field's rules applied to it at all. White light bled across Luffy's skin in place of his usual tan, hair bleaching pale and wild, eyes taking on a strange, luminous quality that made even the battlecruiser's sensors flicker and struggle to properly categorize what they were now looking at. The dampening field's weight, which had been pressing down with mechanical, insistent force moments earlier, simply evaporated, not overcome so much as rendered entirely, cosmically irrelevant. "What?" breathed the Vorta officer aboard the lead cruiser, watching his ship's sensors return readings that made no logical sense whatsoever. "Is happening?" Luffy laughed, bright, booming, genuinely delighted, the sound of a man who had just remembered, in the middle of a fight that had briefly, seriously frightened him, exactly how much fun this particular power was to unleash. "Gear 5th, he said, and the words carried a weight that seemed, somehow, to make the very fabric of the battle around him bend slightly toward his will. What followed defied easy description by anyone watching, whether from the Bellerophon's bridge, the small straw hat vessel, or the increasingly desperate tactical stations of the Dominion fleet itself. Luffy moved with a fluid, cartoonish elasticity that seemed to rewrite the basic physics of momentum and mass around him, striking with fists that inflated to impossible size, bouncing off nothing, propelled by something that looked less like conventional force and more like sheer, irrepressible whimsy given physical form. "Gomu Gomu no," he called out, already 3 strikes into a combination too fast and too strange for the lead cruiser's targeting systems to properly track. Bajrang gun. The single, colossal punch that followed connected with the battle cruiser's hull, not with a conventional impact, but with something that seemed to fold the ship's forward structure inward on itself, like paper crushed by a hand the size of a moon, hurling the entire vessel backward through space, with a force that defied every conventional understanding of mass and inertia. The Federation's physicists would spend years afterward trying, and failing, to fully model. The dampening field died with the ship's primary systems, its purpose rendered moot against a power that had never once needed to fight it directly. Around the ruined battlecruiser, the remaining Dominion vessels, 13 ships that had, moments earlier, been executing a disciplined, adapted assault against a joint task force straining at the edge of its capacity, found themselves suddenly, catastrophically facing something none of their careful preparation had accounted for at all. "Report," Vaughn said, staring at the view screen with an expression that mingled professional shock with something closer to genuine, disbelieving awe. "Captain," T'Preth said, her own composure fully, visibly cracked now. "I am reading energy fluctuations from Luffy's position that exceed every parameter our sensors are designed to measure. He has," she paused, searching for words that felt, even to her precise scientific mind, inadequate. "He has fundamentally altered the tactical situation, single-handedly. On the surface below, on Trevian 3 itself, where 400,000 people had spent the last several hours in the particular, gut-clenching terror of watching their world's fate decided by a battle they could only glimpse in flashes of distant light across their orbital sky. Something in the pattern of that light shifted, the desperate, grinding chaos of mutual bombardment giving way, gradually and then all at once, to something that looked, unmistakably, like retreat. The rest of the battle unfolded with a speed that left even Vaughn's considerable combat experience struggling to keep pace. Zoro and Sanji, freed from the pressure of the Dominion's adapted countermeasures the moment Luffy's transformation scrambled the enemy fleet's entire coordinated strategy, pressed their own advantage with renewed, devastating efficiency. The joint task force, sensing the tide's sudden, dramatic turn, coordinated a final, decisive push that shattered what remained of the Dominion's disciplined formation entirely. Within 40 minutes of Gear 5's activation, the battle for Trevelyan 3 was, unmistakably, decisively won. 9 Dominion vessels destroyed or disabled, 4 in full retreat, and the planet below, for the second time in a single month, saved from a siege that had, this time, come far closer to succeeding than anyone aboard the Bellerophon wanted to admit. Luffy found himself, in the exhausted, adrenaline-crashing aftermath, drifting in the wreckage-strewn space where the battle had raged. Gear 5's transformation fading gradually back into his ordinary form. The specific, bone-deep exhaustion of having pushed genuinely, meaningfully past his own limits, settling into every fiber of his body. Luffy, Nami's voice crackled over the comm, thick with relief that made no attempt to hide itself. Luffy, are you okay? What was that? What did you just... I've never seen anything like that, not even from you. I'm okay, Luffy said, breathing hard, grin tired but genuine. That's a thing I can do. Didn't want to use it unless I really had to. Kinda takes a lot out of me. You think? Nami's voice cracked, half laugh, half something closer to tears. You scared the absolute life out of me, you idiot. Get back here. Now. Chopper's gonna want to check every single thing about you. And honestly, so do I. Yeah, Luffy said softly, watching the wreckage of the Dominion's shattered fleet drift silently around him, watching Trevelyan 3's world turn peacefully below, safe now, for however long this particular peace managed to hold. Yeah, I'm coming home. Aboard the Bellerophon, Vaughn allowed himself, finally, a long, unsteady breath, the particular release of a commander who had, for the length of an entire brutal engagement, genuinely believed they might lose everything, and had watched, instead, an impossible boy in a straw hat rewrite the entire shape of what victory looked like. To Preth, he said quietly, get me status reports from the other 7 engagements. I want to know how the rest of this war's longest day actually went. Already compiling, Captain. A pause. And then, with something that might have been the closest thing to genuine relief to Preth's careful Vulcan composure ever permitted itself. Preliminary reports are favorable, Captain. 6 of the 7 secondary engagements report successful defensive holds. The 7th, a brief hesitation. The 7th reports a costly withdrawal, but with minimal loss of life. Overall, Captain, I believe we can characterize today's engagement as a genuine, theater-level victory. Vaughn nodded slowly, watching the tactical display resolve into a picture he hadn't dared hope for when this impossibly long day began. A war that had, for 11 grinding, uncertain months, felt genuinely unwinnable, suddenly, unmistakably, showing the first real signs of a tide beginning, finally, to turn. Far across the sector, in the golden chamber where founders conferred in patient, ancient silence, Weiyun 7 delivered a report that carried, for the first time in his considerable career serving the Dominion's interests, genuine uncertainty about what came next. The countermeasure failed, Founder, he said carefully. Not through any flaw in its design. Our analysts confirm the dampening technology functioned precisely as intended, suppressing his previously demonstrated abilities entirely. The subject responded by accessing a capability we had no prior indication he possessed at all, a transformation beyond anything in his established combat profile. Beyond it how, Weiyun? Founder, Weiyun said, and for the first time in this entire long, careful campaign of patient assessment and calculated risk, his voice carried something close to genuine, unguarded awe. I do not believe we were ever fighting merely a powerful individual. I believe, based on today's engagement, that we may have been testing the patience of something considerably closer to a god. The golden mist stirred, slow and heavy with the particular weight of a decision that would, in the days and weeks that followed, reshape not merely a single war, but the entire, careful calculus by which the Dominion had approached this conflict from its very beginning. Then perhaps Weyoun, the founder said finally, quiet and deliberate, it is time the Dominion considered whether this war is one we can still afford to win by force at all. The weeks that followed the Battle of Treveyan III unfolded with the particular, disorienting quality of an ending that refused to arrive cleanly. Because wars, Vaughn had learned across 11 months of grinding attrition, rarely ended in a single decisive stroke, no matter how dramatic that stroke happened to be. What changed, instead, was something harder to chart on any tactical display: the shape of the war itself, the confidence with which both sides approached every subsequent engagement, the quiet, cascading recalculation happening in command centers across the entire theater. Starfleet Intelligence's analysis, delivered to Vaughn in a briefing 3 days after the battle, put it in terms that felt almost clinically understated, given everything they'd witnessed. Dominion troop movements along the Western Front have decreased approximately 40% in the days following the Treveyan engagement, the briefing officer reported, her image steady on the Bellerophon's conference room screen. Comm intercepts suggest internal debate at the highest levels of Dominion command regarding the overall viability of continued offensive operations in this sector. We're not calling this a war-ending event, Captain, but we are calling it a genuine inflection point. An inflection point, Zara repeated dryly, her own image occupying the adjacent screen, is Starfleet's diplomatic way of saying, we may have actually won something that matters, Captain Vaughn. Central Command's assessment is rather more direct. We believe the Dominion has, for the first time since this war began, genuinely reconsidered whether this front is worth the cost of continuing to contest. That's not the same as peace, Vaughn said carefully. No, Zara agreed. It is, however, considerably better than 11 months of grinding, uncertain attrition with no end in sight. I will take the improvement, Captain, and worry about the rest as it comes. It was a sentiment Vaughn found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, largely sharing, a cautious, hard-earned optimism that felt genuinely new after so long spent simply enduring, rather than believing in an actual path toward something better. For the crew of the Straw Hat Pirates, the weeks after Treveyan III carried their own particular weight, the strange, disorienting process of becoming, gradually and almost without anyone fully deciding it, something like permanent fixtures within a quadrant that had, only 2 months earlier, known nothing of their existence at all. Luffy spent the first several days in genuine, uncharacteristic quiet, the physical and spiritual toll of Gear 5th's extended use taking longer to recover from than even Chopper's careful medical attention could fully address. It wasn't until nearly a week after the battle that Nami found him where she'd half expected to, alone in the observation lounge, watching the stars with the same fascinated stillness he'd shown in his very first days aboard the Bellerophon, though something in his posture now carried considerably more weight than simple wonder. "Hey," she said, settling beside him without preamble, the easy, practiced familiarity of years spent as his closest confidant asserting itself naturally. "You've been quiet. Quieter than usual, I mean, which is saying something given how loud you normally are about literally everything." Luffy's mouth curved, tired but genuine.
"Just thinking."
About how this isn't really our fight. He didn't look away from the stars as he said it, voice carrying something reflective, almost surprised at his own thoughts. "Not originally, I mean. We didn't come here looking for a war. I just got yanked through some hole in the sky and ended up in the middle of one that already belonged to a whole bunch of people who aren't even from our world. And," Nami prompted gently, "and I don't regret any of it. Not 1 second. He turned to look at her now, something fierce and certain settling behind his eyes despite the lingering exhaustion. But I keep thinking about how many more fights like this are still out there. Not just here, everywhere. However many worlds like this one exist. However many wars are happening right now that we don't even know about. And I can't fight all of them, Nami. Nobody can. That used to bother me more than it does now, I think. 'Cause back home, at least I knew the shape of the fight. Yonko, Marines, the whole system we were up against. Here, it's just, he gestured vaguely at the star-strewn viewport, bigger than anything I really understand yet. Nami was quiet for a moment, considering her answer with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to navigating any genuinely difficult passage. You know what I think? I think you don't have to fight every war, Luffy. You never have. You've always just fought the ones that landed in front of you, as hard and as fully as you could, and trusted that doing that well mattered more than trying to fix everything everywhere all at once. That's not a flaw. That's kind of always been the whole secret to how you actually manage to change things. Luffy considered this, something in his expression easing, gratitude and old, familiar trust settling comfortably into place. Yeah, maybe you're right. He grinned, some of his usual brightness finally returning in full. Guess I just gotta keep doing what I always do then. Fight what's in front of me. Protect who I can. Figure the rest out as it comes. That's the spirit, Nami said, bumping her shoulder against his. Also, for what it's worth, I don't regret this either. Any of it. Scary as it's been. Yeah, she smiled, watching the stars alongside him. We've been through worse, with less reason to believe it'd turn out okay. This cruise never needed a map that made total sense before we followed it somewhere worth going. Why start now? Captain Vaughn's own reckoning with everything that had happened arrived in a quieter, more private moment. A final report he found himself drafting for Admiral Tanaka nearly 2 weeks after Trevelyan 3, the words coming slower and more considered than any after-action report he'd filed across 11 months of previous engagements. The presence of Monkey D. Luffy and his crew within this theater has fundamentally altered not merely the tactical balance of this conflict, but, and I say this with full awareness of how unusual it will read in an official Starfleet document, the emotional and moral texture of an alliance that had, before their arrival, been sustained largely by grim necessity rather than genuine hope. I have served alongside countless capable officers across my career. I have rarely, if ever, served alongside anyone who fights with such complete, uncomplicated moral clarity, or who has managed, in the span of a few short weeks, to remind an exhausted, war-worn coalition of exactly what they were fighting to protect in the first place. I do not know how long Luffy and his crew intend to remain in this quadrant. I understand, from private conversation, that finding a way home remains their ultimate priority, and I would not presume to ask them to set that priority aside for our benefit. But I would be remiss, Admiral, if I did not note for the official record that whatever comes next in this war, whether toward genuine peace or toward further, harder fighting, this theater is measurably, meaningfully better for having had them fighting alongside it, however briefly that alliance ultimately proves to last. He sent the report and found himself, in the quiet that followed, genuinely uncertain whether he hoped Luffy's crew would find their way home soon, or whether some part of him hoped, selfishly, that the search might take just a little longer yet. It was Robin, 3 weeks after Trevelyan 3, who finally uncovered something that shifted the entire question from theoretical to genuinely, imminently possible. Poring through Federation scientific archives with the same patient, scholarly hunger she'd brought to every mystery across her own world's long, difficult history, cross-referencing theoretical subspace physics against the residual signature that had first delivered Luffy into this quadrant weeks earlier. Captain Vaughn, she said, gathering the crew and Vaughn together in the conference room with an energy that carried, for the normally composed archaeologist, genuine excitement. I believe I've found something significant. Federation theoretical physics has long theorized the existence of what your scientists term transient dimensional apertures, rifts, similar to the one that brought Luffy here, that occasionally recur at specific points where the fabric between realities has been previously weakened. You're saying the rift could open again, Vaughn said slowly. I'm saying it's more probable than not, based on the residual signature analysis. And more significantly, Robin pulled up a complex series of calculations, cross-referenced against both Federation theoretical models and fragments of half-remembered knowledge from her own world's ancient, scattered texts. I believe working together, Federation science and what limited theoretical understanding exists within Luffy's own world regarding these phenomena, we may actually be able to predict, with reasonable confidence, when and where such a recurrence might next occur. The room fell silent, the weight of the implications settling across everyone present. How long? Luffy asked quietly. If you're right, how long until we'd actually know? Weeks, at minimum, for the calculations to reach sufficient confidence. Possibly months. Robin met his gaze steadily. I cannot promise certainty, Luffy. Dimensional physics of this nature remain, even within Federation science, largely theoretical. But I believe, for the first time since we arrived here, we have a genuine, actionable path toward finding our way home, rather than simply waiting, indefinitely, for chance to intervene again. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a complicated tangle of emotions Vaughn had learned, over these past weeks, to read fairly well. Hope, warring gently with something that might have been genuine, unexpected reluctance. That's, he started, then stopped, considering his words with unusual care. That's really good news, Robin. Thank you. Genuinely. But, Nami prompted, catching the hesitation immediately. But I guess I'm realizing, Luffy said slowly, that I'm gonna miss this place. Which is weird, 'cause it's been kind of an insane couple months, and there's still a war going on, and none of this makes any sense compared to home. He looked around at Vaughn, at the crew, at the star chart still projected behind them showing a theater of conflict that had, gradually and almost without anyone fully choosing it, become something like a second home. But I found people worth fighting for here too. That's not nothing. That's actually kind of everything, if I'm honest. Vaughn found himself, listening to this, quietly, deeply moved. In a way 11 months of grinding war had left him increasingly unaccustomed to feeling. For what it's worth, he said, this quadrant will be considerably better prepared to handle whatever comes next because of everything you've taught us these past weeks. That doesn't go away just because you eventually find your way home. Yeah, Luffy said, grin returning, warm and genuine despite the bittersweet weight still lingering underneath it. Yeah, I guess it doesn't. He straightened, some of his usual restless energy reasserting itself, the particular, unshakable optimism that had carried him through every impossible fight, across 2 entire universes now settling comfortably back into place. All right, so we've got a possible way home, whenever it actually opens up. Until then, he looked around at Vaughn, at Zayra's image still patched in from her own command, at his crew gathered close around him. Guess we keep doing what we've been doing, fighting for the people who need it, finding out what kind of trouble this whole quadrant still got waiting for us. There's likely to be considerable trouble yet, T'Preth observed. The Dominion's reconsideration of this front does not guarantee lasting peace, merely a genuine opportunity toward it. Good, Zoro said, the ghost of a grin crossing his own usually stoic features. Wouldn't want things getting boring. Laughter rippled around the conference room. Genuine, easy laughter. The particular sound of a crew and an alliance that had, across weeks of impossible odds and hard-won victories, found something considerably more valuable than any single battle's outcome: the unshakable, hard-earned trust that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The war did not end with the Battle of Trevian III. Wars rarely end so cleanly, and this one, vast, grinding, older than a single boy's arrival could ever fully unravel, would grind on for months yet, through negotiations and skirmishes, and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust between powers who had spent too long treating each other as enemies first and neighbors second. But something had shifted, permanently, in the shape of what that war meant to the people fighting it. And that shift, more than any single victory, was the thing that would echo longest. Trevian III rebuilt, slowly, its 400,000 people carrying forward the particular, hard-won gratitude of a world that understood exactly how close it had come to a very different fate. Gul Zera rose, eventually, to a position of genuine influence within Central Command, carrying into every subsequent negotiation a lesson she'd learned watching a straw-hatted boy choose mercy, even when it cost him nothing to choose otherwise. That strength, wielded with restraint, built more lasting peace than strength wielded without it ever could. Captain Vaughn continued commanding the Bellerophon through the difficult months that followed, carrying with him always the memory of a war that had, for one brief, extraordinary stretch, felt genuinely winnable rather than merely endurable. And somewhere in the vast, star-strewn dark of a quadrant that had never once, in all its long history, encountered anything quite like them, the Straw Hat Pirates continued doing what they had always done, across 2 seas and 100 impossible fights, and now, improbably, an entire war that had never originally belonged to them at all. They found the people worth protecting, and they protected them, fully and without hesitation, one fight at a time. Robin's calculations, when they finally reached sufficient confidence some months later, would open a path home, a rift, carefully predicted and precisely timed, waiting to carry Luffy and his crew back to the world and the people and the endless, open sea they had never once stopped longing for. But that, and everything it would mean for a quadrant that had grown, gradually and genuinely, to love them, was a story for another day. For now, there was simply this: a boy in a straw hat, standing at the edge of a starship's viewport, watching a world he'd helped save turn safely below him, grinning the same unshakable grin that had carried him across every impossible distance he'd ever crossed. Somewhere out there, an entire ocean was still waiting for him. He'd get there. He always did. He just wasn't in quite as much of a hurry to leave as he might once have been, because somewhere along the way, in the middle of a war that was never his to fight, he'd found something he hadn't expected to find at all. He'd found, once again, people worth calling family, and for Monkey D. Luffy, in any universe, in any sea, under any sky, that had always, and would always, be more than enough.